The leak of this information was made possible by E.
My interest is in the last two paragraphs of the chat. I'm not. So, are you familiar? My first question is: are you familiar with this chat that is alleged to have taken place between you and another? It's identified as another computer hacker in May of 2010. Are you familiar with this exchange?
I can neither confirm nor deny the authenticity of any such documents or communications. No, that is covered under the non-disclosure agreement.
Okay. All right. During the time that you were downloading or transferring information from your workstation, were you during the time that you were doing that and you were downloading onto DVDs, were you at any time bringing CDs, music CDs into the office and
yes.
labeled? Yes. Okay. So,
sorry.
My question is: were you bringing in a music CD and then later rewriting compressed information onto that DVD?
Yes.
Okay. And did anyone, to your knowledge, did anyone in your unit or in your workstation area ever suspect that you were doing downloading or taking information? To your knowledge?
Well, everybody brought in CDs like that that were written with different things, so it was pretty common behavior. I do not know whether I can't speculate as to whether they were doing the same or not, but it was pretty common for CDs to be looked the other way between coming and going, to put music or movies onto workstations. And I don't know whether people were taking things off, but it was not unheard of for it to happen.
Okay. So I only have a few more questions, and they relate to the actual the information contained in the alleged in the report that the report 44. I want to confirm the dates at which Miss Manning was convicted. And I don't think that's too leading in the question. I'd like to confirm. Can you please state whether or not you were convicted on July 30th of 2013
yes,
in the United States?
Yes, I was found guilty at court-martial, and then we immediately went into the sentencing phase of the trial. Yes.
Okay, and what was your sentence?
The sentence was 35 years imprisonment with forfeiture of all pay and allowances, a dishonorable discharge, and a reduction in pay and grade, essentially a reduction rank to E1, which is the lowest rank for enlisted people in the military.
Okay, and did you appeal the sentence or the conviction, or both?
We appealed both.
Okay.
We appealed portions of the sentence and portions of the. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't recall exactly what all we appealed, but there was a lengthy, exhaustive appeal process that lasted several years.
And you confirm that you were represented by counsel throughout this entire process?
Yes. Nancy Hollander and Vincent Ward were my civilian counsel. I had military counsel, but that would flow through. Okay.
And the results of your appeal? I know I'm referring to the Court of Appeal document, but it's more did the appeal decision that I have in front of me is dated the 31st of May of 2018. Is that accurate?
Yes. So the appeal continued for a brief period of time after after my commutation. I don't know. The commutation, I think, to my understanding, sort of muddied the water as to whether or not some of these issues that we had raised we still had standing.
And speaking of commutation, and confirm that your sentence was commuted by a White House order, which we have here filed as a White House order issued on the 17th of January of 2017.
Yes, I was commuted on January 2017, January 17th, 2017, basically to a almost not quite a 7-year sentence. I don't recall the exact number of days, but it was 120 days was the period of time left following January, which eventually was May 17th. I was released of that year.
Okay. Did you at any time apply or receive a pardon for the convictions of for the conviction in 2013?
No, I have not. Wait.
Okay. Well, first, were you pardoned?
No, I was not pardoned. I was given a commutation, which is it's still under the pardon power, but it is slightly different than a full pardon. I did submit a pardon request for a full pardon immediately following my sentencing. That was, I don't even know if it was, I don't even know if it was accepted, let alone denied. So it wasn't, I don't think it was denied. I think it was just declined acceptance to process in that time. And then subsequently in November 2016, I submitted a second request, but this time for a commutation for a reduction of the sentence to 10 years was our request.
Okay. Thank you. I don't have any other further questions for Ms. Manning. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience and my ineptitude using the computer.
Okay, thank you very much, Council Lashley. I was going to break at 12:30, so we're right on time for that. If you don't mind, though, I'll take the few minutes we have left just to clarify one or two things, and then when we come back from the break, obviously, Councils Bloom and Gill will be able to ask their questions. So just very technically now, Ministers' Council's report and their amendment at C3, you've confirmed today that the conviction is July 30th, 2013. In the amendment, they mention adjudicated guilty on the 21st of August, 2013. Can we just clarify why the different dates is one sentencing? Maybe if councils from Ms. Manning want to clarify that. Or Ms. Manning.
If I understand the question correctly, it's a question about one of the minister's exhibits. Maybe they're best positioned to clarify.
But your client did confirm today that she was just moments ago that she was convicted on July 30th. But in the minister's replacement text, I guess yes, the question should be for the minister. You're right that you have the date of August 21st. So if
yes, my apologies. I was reading from the left side of the page.
Yeah.
So, Mrs. Manning, my question to you is. You mentioned that when I asked you for July 30th, you mentioned that was a conviction date. Was there a sentencing date?
That was August 31st of 2013. August 21st, 2013. I want to.
And that's confirmed. That's the date that you were sentenced.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, that's clear. Thank you. Just a second. So, Ms. Manning, I just have two questions to clarify some of your testimony. Normally, I leave them to the end until after your councils have questioned you, but since we have a few minutes and it's closer in time for your memory, I'll ask them now. You mentioned Minister's Council asked you about bringing in CDs or DVDs to your workstation and then copying some data onto them, and you said that it was, from what I understood, it was a common practice for
yes,
personnel to do so, and they would turn a blind eye. Does that mean you were not allowed to bring in such devices into your workstation?
Correct, but it was common practice regardless.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So I'd just like to go back because I was taking notes and some things the timeline isn't making sense to me, and I just want to make sure I understood you correctly. So we're just going to go back to the time where you were talking about the fact that you were on leave and you were trying to communicate with different media organizations to relay the information that you had in your possession.
Yes, ma'am.
So situated in time, we're talking about January 2010?
January 2010. January and early February 2010, I believe, ma'am.
Okay, and you were on leave from the military, i.e. you were back in the United States and considered on official leave?
Yes, ma'am. I was in civilian clothes during the whole time.
Okay, and how long was your leave?
It was approximately 2 weeks. I know that there's a day-by-day schedule that I've confirmed in the past, and I don't recall it exactly off the top of my head. But it was approximately 2 weeks, and unfortunately, some of those days were taken up by just flights between Atlanta and my home.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that, and again, I'm going to try to summarize your testimony, but I need you to correct me if I'm getting it wrong. You made attempts to communicate with the Washington Post, the New York Times,
yes, ma'am.
and Politico.
I never followed through on the political thing. It didn't pan out because there was a blizzard. So,
all right, it was an idea that you never followed through on. So, am I correct to conclude that did you ever have any official communication, or was it just attempts that never went anywhere?
I had communications with the Washington Post. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what was the nature of the communications? What was discussed?
What was discussed was trying to arrange. I mean, I did not feel comfortable using a regular telephone to make this conversation. So I was trying to arrange, and I went to basically different locations throughout DC and tried to establish telephonic communications with a journalist. And I struggled to. I sort of struggled. There was sort of a conflict of like the amount of time, a lack of understanding of why I needed to do this so quickly, which was a factor. Also, the fact that I wanted to establish encrypted communications, a means of communicating through some secure electronic means. And the journalist at the Washington Post did not know how to set this up or why I would need to do this. Okay. And they wanted to schedule me for a date later in time, but that would have been outside of my leave, and I was uncertain of how to explain to them my short period of time without disclosing who I was or where I was working.
Okay, so all this was done, as you just said, anonymously. You never identified yourself to the journalist or identified that you were a member of the military.
I believe I referred to myself as an employee of the Department of Defense. I would think I was vague. I don't recall if I gave anything more than my first name.
Okay. And so that was the only actual contact you had with a journalist in regards to what you stated as your desire to share this information.
At that time, yes, I believe that's the case.
Yes. So we're still back in on your leave of February 2010. So then in your testimony, you indicated that, and this is where I think I lost you. You said that you uploaded the information to them from a Starbucks.
Oh, yes. That was to the website. That was to the Wikileaks website.
Okay, so that's where you were talking about Wikileaks specifically. So after you determined that releasing or providing the information to the Washington Post wasn't going to work out for the reasons you've just stated, you determined, again, during this period of your leave, you decided to upload the information to Wikileaks instead.
Yes, I ran out of time, essentially.
and after this was done, you returned to service. You returned to your post. Is that correct?
Yes. The next within 8 hours of that happening, I was on the plane to Atlanta for processing back onto the military plane system, the military transport system.
Okay.
So I was in uniform within the next day.
Okay. Okay, I think those were the things I wanted to clarify. Just a second, please. I have another question, but you haven't testified to this yet, so I'll wait for your counsels to finish their questions, and then I'll come back to it if it hasn't been answered. With your questions. Okay, so I think we can take a lunch break now. We'll take 1 hour. We'll come back at 1:30, and we'll resume with the questions of counsels from Ms. Manning. Sorry, I'm just trying to estimate here. So when we come back at 1:30, I'm assuming your witness is available Professor Matthews is available this afternoon, right? So she would be available to at least start her testimony.
Yes.
Okay, very well. Okay, so let's break now, and when we come back, we'll resume and see when we're done with Ms. Manning's testimony how we want to continue. I will mention now that I will be stopping the recording, but I will not be disconnecting. Okay, I will keep it open. The parties can choose to disconnect and reconnect if you wish to. Same thing for the observers. I don't think there should be an issue. I will let everyone back in at 1:30 if you wish to disconnect. If you want to leave it open, you can do so as well, but maybe you need to use the platform for other reasons. So that's all for now. Let me just stop the recording before we go. Okay, so I've restarted the recording. Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to resume the admissibility proceeding concerning Chelsea Elizabeth Manning. All the same parties as this morning are present. So unless Ministers' counsels have something else that they want to add on, I think we're ready for counsels from Ms. Manning to begin with their questions.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. So Counsel Gill, you'll be leading the questions then?
I will, thank you.
Go ahead. So Ms. Manning, it's the same as this morning. I'm going to ask you to unmute your mic, and if at any point there's distortion or you don't understand a question, please say so. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. As you know, we prepared to start this examination today. So really, I'm going to be asking you some questions that kind of complete the conversation you already had with Mr. Lashley this morning. So let's start with how old were you when you enlisted in the U.S. military?
I believe I was 19 years old whenever I enlisted in 2007.
Okay. And why did you enlist?
I enlisted mostly for I tried to I wanted money from the bonus. The Iraq War was kind of at its height. I wanted to enlist because I wanted access to education through the Montgomery GI Bill, which was then upgraded to the post 9/11 GI Bill, which is sort of a government tuition program for enlisted military personnel to go to college. So I wanted to finish college. I also the Iraq War was at its height, and it was on the news every night, and I was dealing with a lot of issues like being dealing with questions about me being trans and me being in the working at Starbucks and struggling to go to college. And I felt like maybe I could contribute in some way, given that there was this big thing happening in the news. And also my father who was in the Navy, had kicked me out the year before. So I was kind of aimless and homeless for a year prior to enlisting in the military. And then I moved in with my aunt. And I lived with my aunt for a period of time before I enlisted. And while I was living with my aunt, kind of aimless and directionless, I started to speak with my father again, and he strongly encouraged me to enlist in either the Navy or the Air Force. And obviously, me being a rebellious kid, I enlisted in the Army. So those are the reasons.
Thank you. And how old are you now?
I think 33. I think.
And,
December 17, 1987. Yeah, I think I turned 34 this year. So yes, I'm 33.
And do you remember how old you were at the time of your arrest?
I was 22 when I entered confinement in 2010.
Okay. And where were you deployed at the time of your arrest?
At the time, I was in eastern Baghdad, Iraq. I was at a forward operating base, Hammer, which was slightly outside of the city of Baghdad, about 20 miles outside of the outer skirts of eastern Baghdad. But our area of operations at the time was eastern Baghdad, just south of Sadr City.
Okay. Perfect. We discussed this already this morning, but I just wanted to ask you a few questions about the Providence Statement, which is in the record. Includes statements about the events that led to your conviction for your trial. It's dated 29th of January, 2013. It's at tab 9, page 172 and following. You recognize this statement?
Yes, ma'am.
Why was the statement prepared?
The statement was prepared in order for me to do what is called a naked plea in the military court martial system. So this is a plea done without an agreement. So I pled guilty to some charges, and then to lesser included offenses. And so I walked through for the judge the reasons why I was pleading guilty to some of these charges for the disclosures that I did. And it was also prepared. It went through a lengthy preparation period because of the sensitivity of what could be and could not be disclosed in open court.
Okay, thank you. Does that statement still reflect your memory of the events?
Yes, it is the most complete record of the events that is accessible to the public. Everything there's more context and more information, but it is covered under the existing non-disclosure agreements regarding classified information.
Okay, thank you. And when you made those admissions, you made them freely?
I did. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so I have some questions now about the documents that you disclosed. And I apologize if any of this feels repetitive from our conversation this morning. The documents that you disclosed, were they the kinds of records that you generally or routinely worked with in the course of your duties?
Yes. Almost everything. I think the Guantanamo documents were a little less outside of my scope at that time frame, but I had access and had routinely accessed them prior to my deployment in Iraq in 2009, in late 2009.
Okay, and you had access to all of those documents in the ordinary course of your duties?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when you made the decision to disclose the documents, how did you decide which of these records to disclose and not to disclose?
Yes, ma'am. So the documents that I had access to I had very broad access. I was an intelligence analyst, so I had access to some of the most sensitive sources and methods available to the United States government in that time frame. Most of the material that I worked with was at a much, much higher classification level and at a much, much higher level of sensitivity than these kinds of records. The kinds of records that were that were disclosed were the kind of things that I had you didn't necessarily have to be an intelligence analyst to have access to this kind of thing. So they were pretty easily available and were viewed as important for context, certainly, but as historical documents, as being records and of things that have happened, not necessarily future operations or what we would call FUOPs, like things that are going to happen, or sensitive sources and methods, which have different markings and are held, which are much more closely held. And the office that I worked at was a sensitive compartmentalized information facility. Most of these records did not have to come from a SCIF. I just happened to work in that kind of environment where there is much more sensitive material. So the rationale is that these are historical records, not particularly sensitive, and I worked with the stuff pretty regularly, and I worked with much more sensitive information that I certainly felt at the time was not necessary or safe to disclose to anybody.
Okay. This morning, when you were talking with my colleague about information regarding protected sources or informants, you mentioned that was an entirely different category of information. Was the information that you leaked in that category?
No, ma'am.
Okay. When you leaked the documents, did you think that any of those documents would harm the United States?
I did not believe that it would harm people or the United States in the sense of physical harm or damage. I certainly understood that this stuff is pretty damning. So in the sense of the United States feeling that this information is embarrassing or damning in some way politically, I did have a sense of that. But I in terms of actual, the definition of harm here is it depends on sort of the definition of harm. So the answer is no. I didn't think it would harm anyone. But I did certainly know that the distinction between what the U.S. was saying and what was actually happening, which was kind of the point, was to bring this to light, was to draw attention to this fact. So in that regard of the sort of reputation status.
Okay. And this morning with my colleague, you talked about how you had experience with mechanisms for internal redress in the military. If you had tried to report this information to your superiors rather than go public with these records, what do you believe would have happened to you?
Well, I didn't need to. This wasn't a hypothetical. There was, in fact, one occasion in which I submitted a equal opportunity report unrelated to the disclosures. So this doesn't involve intelligence information. This is just a workplace environment harassment, very toxic workplace environment complaint that I made anonymously, given the fact that some of my colleagues were using things like racial epithets, homophobic, sort of slurs and things, and putting some pretty awful and toxic jokes up on boards and things, and I was feeling increasingly uncomfortable with this, and I was not alone in this. So I submitted an anonymous, unsigned equal opportunity complaint. And two of the officers this was brought to the attention of the officers. It was basically just a warning, like, hey, like, you need to take these things down. You need to not do these things. And when this happened, whenever they were made aware of this, they retaliated, but because they didn't know who it was from, they retaliated against the wrong person. So they harassed, they intimidated, and they threatened. They're basically very threatening and they eventually moved somebody based upon this complaint that I made. I know this was just an equal opportunity complaint, and so I saw somebody else take the fall for something for a complaint that I submitted, which made me very wary of the complaint system and the complaint process. And this happened in I believe December 2009.
Okay, I'm just looking through my notes. If you'll give me one moment. Okay. Apologies, I lost a page reference. Okay. Okay, can you just explain in your own words why you felt it was necessary to make these documents public?
I get asked this question a lot. I get asked this question so many times, and it always feels so self-evident to me, the gravity of these documents and the things that it shows, because now people take it for granted that the sort of disaster of Iraq and Afghanistan and the understanding of like what kinds of things were happening and the significant number of casualties that were unreported and just what happened, like, in terms of like how broad the scope of the war was, and how many resources were being used in different manners for basically to no end. It was kind of not going anywhere. And sort of by 2010, I think people take it for granted now, but it was very, very positive news coverage and very muted. And there was a new administration, and there was a lot of criticism of the George W. Bush administration in particular over the war, but the incoming administration started to fade from people's memory, and I was just shocked at how little people knew about how bad the war in particular was, and also like when it came to the State Department cables in particular, how we got into this position was important. These are SIP disk cables, so these are these are very defense discussion oriented diplomatic discussions, and it sort of just shows sort of how the war on terror, at the time it was called the war on terror, was being sold to different places, and how it was sort of a broad, all-encompassing, it was a broad and all-encompassing effort involving every country you could think of, to sort of just pit to draw everybody else into essentially what was going on. So it was just this broad, huge systemic problem that I wanted to show how the sausage was made and how these discussions were happening and whatnot. There was no end to the scope of this. Like what was happening in one country was what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan was directly tied to what was happening all over the world. It was a broad, encompassing effort.
Thank you. This was the page I lost earlier. In your Providence statement, paragraphs 24 and 25, you describe an incident while you were still deployed in February 2010, where there were 15 individuals detained for printing anti-Iraqi literature. And
Right.
I won't read the whole 2 pages, but it's clear from this document. Please correct me if I'm misrepresenting anything here. I'm sure opposing counsel will. There was detention of 15 individuals in Iraq. They were printing literature that was critical of the government at the time. You felt concerned about the fact that those individuals were being targeted. You attempted to raise the issue, and I'll just read it here. The TOC, OIC, and the overhearing battle captain, this is on page 25 or page 196 of the volume 1. The overhearing battle captain informed me they didn't need or want to know this information anymore. They told me to drop it and to just assist them and the FP in finding out where more of these print shops creating anti-Iraqi literature might be.
Yes.
That's still true.
Yes. So, I mean, if I can just explain very briefly that what was happening was that I was essentially tasked earlier that night to find out what was happening with this operation, and I immediately, very quickly, found out that the Iraqi Federal Police, under the Ministry of Interior, were essentially rounding up political dissidents of then Prime Minister Prime Minister al-Awlaki, and so I knew this was a political crackdown and not an actual anti-terrorism operation, since it was pamphlets, and he had a translator actually go through the pamphlets, and it was pretty clear that this was just a crackdown on political dissent in the run up to the election, and like I said, I brought this up to. I mean, I was asked to investigate this. I gave my results, and I was like, "Look, like this is a political crackdown," and they're like, you know, I was essentially screamed at for doing my job.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, just because there were questions about this issue earlier, we're still in the Providence statement. It mentions that you just wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify this. It mentions that you called the New York Times.
I did. I made a phone call to the New York Times. I think I got through to their. I think they ended up forwarding them to my public editor, to their public editor, which is not an actual journalist.
Okay, but the results of your outreach to the New York Times were unsuccessful.
Yes, I got the runaround.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about your arrest. Can you explain when and where you were arrested?
So I was placed in confinement in late May of 2010. In the military, you're just kind of ordered into confinement. It's a strange way of phrasing it. But I was I was escorted to Kuwait after a very brief charging hearing, and sent to Camp Arifjan in Kuwait for I think like 59 or 60 days, for basically a gigantic 8x10 tiger cage inside of I call it the tiger cage. So it was essentially a metal contraption with corrugated steel and a mattress, and it was inside of a tent with very little air conditioning, and it was very dusty in there and dark. And I was held there incommunicado for I when I was in there, I did not even know how many days it was, because every day looked the same from in there.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about your time, both in pretrial detention and when you were serving your sentence. Okay.
Okay.
So really any time that you were imprisoned in relation to these offenses. But let's start first. At the time of your detention prior to your trial, had you come out to yourself or other people as trans?
Yes, I had come out as trans to my therapist and to a couple of people that I knew.
Okay.
I was still in the closet, and I hadn't actually acted on anything yet, but I kind of knew by late 2009.
Okay. And you were in a you were in a men's prison for how much of this time?
I mean, I was in when I wasn't in solitary confinement, I was in general population with males the entirety of my confinement in 2000, from 2010 to 2017.
Okay. Were you under the care of a doctor at any point during your time in prison?
I was. I had multiple therapists. I don't recall their names, but I was examined by multiple military therapists. Particularly, I had a period of suicidal ideation while I was in Kuwait, where I considered, it was a very dark time, very dark cell, or not even a cell, like a cage. So I went over the deep end. So I started seeing psychiatrist after that.
Okay. And so, did you engage in, and I'm sorry for asking these questions, because I know they're hard questions to ask and answer. And so I really am grateful. Did you engage in any form of self-harm during your time in prison?
And sometime during that time in Kuwait, I don't recall the dates. It's all a blur. But I did. There was an attempt in Kuwait. It was half-hearted because I was under 24/7 observation already at that point. But I did have an attempt, but it was impossible to follow through.
Mm-hmm. How many days approximately did you spend in some form of solitary confinement?
The military calls it administrative segregation, or but essentially I was essentially alone the entirety of the rest of 2010, from May to obviously prison staff and jail staff I was interacting with, but I was alone in my cell throughout my time in Kuwait. Then I was sent to Quantico in Virginia, which was a journey in itself. It was quite a shock to the system. I was in an air-conditioned building for the first time in a while, and that was whenever I really started to come back, because I was in a brick and mortar building in the United States, and so it took me a little bit of time, but I was in solitary confinement, what's commonly referred to as solitary confinement, the entirety of that time while I was at Marine Corps Base Quantico. But I was the lights were on all the time. There were two Marines watching me through plexiglass, through one of those one-way mirror, like a one-way glass where you can't, you see the reflection, and they're watching you. There were two Marines observing me at all times, and I was not, during the daytime, I was not allowed to lean back. I could only sit upright and for about 7 hours a day until later in the day, and I was not allowed any physical objects apart from like a blanket and some clothes, and even my glasses were an object that I couldn't have for a period of time. And like if I wanted to read a book, they would let me read a book, and they would hand the book to me, and I would return it back to the Marines as soon as I was done reading. If I wasn't actively using something like a toothbrush or toothpaste or something, then they would take it away from me.
Okay. When you look back on the entire experience of your imprisonment, and here again we're talking both pretrial and during your sentence, how did those experiences impact you psychologically and emotionally?
So I have what my therapist calls complex PTSD, meaning that because I had multiple iterations of time, exposed to these kinds of things over a long period of time, I've developed a form of PTSD that, I'm in a lot of therapy for. So I see a therapist, at least once a week. I've been in therapy for quite some time, and I'm also institutionalized in some way. So I'm sort of recovering and going through therapy for being institutionalized, because I've spent most of my adult life in prison in some form. So as odd as it sounds, my familiarity with the quote unquote free world is less I'm becoming more familiar as I'm adjusting over time, but I often have to tell people that I view things through the lens of my experience through prison as opposed to not being in prison. So it's it's hard because it's what I know, and so I'm more familiar, and sometimes it's more it's just what I know. I know that life better than I do this life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm in therapy for that, and adjusting and things, and I'm trying to adapt and adjust.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a couple of short questions about your trial process, okay? And what was decided at trial. Just remind us approximately when your trial began.
My trial began on June 3rd of 2013, I think.
Okay. And I'm gonna, can you just summarize, what you were charged with in your own words? I know there was a long list and there's evidence, but just a brief summary.
So, everything is connected to the unauthorized disclosures that I made, quite famously at this point, and I was charged with Section 641, which is a generic government information theft charge. There is it's strange because it's only government information. Then there is the 793 charge, which is essentially an unauthorized disclosure of and relating to information of and relating to the national defense. So anything, typically it's classified information, but it doesn't have to be classified information, but anything that the government deems as being held by me and shared to an unauthorized person, was shared regardless of reason or rationale. It is it is an unauthorized disclosure under this statute. And then there's Section 1093, 1090. I'm getting all my numbers mixed up from different things. There's Section 1030 of the U.S. Code of 18 U.S.C. of the U.S. Code, which is it is the same thing as the unauthorized disclosure, but with the use of a computer added to it. So exceeding authorized access, meaning I violated. Sorry, I hit the microphone there. Meaning that I exceeded the authorization by a signed agreement with the government on using a computer to essentially a sort of government internal terms and conditions and violating that on top of that. So it's an extra element to the unauthorized disclosure. And then, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is what's been explained to me repeatedly through this entire process. And then there's the violating a lawful general regulation, which is a very military thing. So it's like if somebody writes a regulation and you violate that regulation, and it's not a crime in any other sense, in any other part of the book of the either the military code or or civilian life, then you can be charged for violating the rules and regulations. And I was that was also related to the disclosures for violating some regulations. And then the other thing is a strange sort of a strange it's a strange concept that I had struggled to explain, but there's a general offense, which is that any conduct or misconduct done that is to the detriment of the good order and discipline of the United States or the armed forces it's very vague. So there's that. Like there's a sort of like you did a thing that was a general offense, and then there's this is what I was charged with, not what I was convicted with. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, and
there was a Article 104 of the UCMJ, which is an aiding the enemy charge, which I was acquitted of, which is it's essentially the military's equivalent of treason, where you provide aid and comfort to a clearly defined enemy of the United States.
And you were acquitted of that charge?
I was, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And there, of course, there is exhibits that detail all of that. So I've just a couple of. So you said you weren't convicted of aiding the enemy. Was there ever evidence of harm to national security or to the U.S. government put forward at your trial?
So the U.S. government did not put any, did not proffer at trial any evidence of what they called actual harm. I'm not a lawyer, but that means potential or could. There's a lot of could have caused, but that's. I mean, the offense doesn't the offenses don't make a distinction between causing harm and could causing harm. But again, I'm not a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. So there was just so that I understand correctly, there was no evidence of actual harm adduced
at trial now. And they made some there were allegations made in closed hearings, but again, it fit within this could have.
Okay. And did the U.S. government ever argue that Wikileaks was a terrorist group?
No.
Okay. So were you convicted of any fraud-related offenses?
No, ma'am. I was charged with everything was related to unauthorized disclosures of sensitive information.
Okay. Were you ever convicted of a computer hacking offense?
No, ma'am. Everything I did was through the channels that were available to me. So, there was an argument that was made that I exceeded authorized access, but that was in violation of a terms of service, which is what in U.S. law, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is what I've been told, is a quote unquote code-based restriction. So I was never charged with violating a quote unquote code-based restriction, which is it is the use of a computer, but a violation of terms of service.
Okay, good. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about that because my colleague brought up a tool called wget.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just going to ask you some basic questions about wget. Did wget allow you to download any documents that you didn't already have access to in the course of your duties?
No, ma'am.
Is wget a computer hacking tool?
No, ma'am. It's not. It's a systems administration tool that is widely used in the computer. The average user probably doesn't use it very often, but anybody that uses computers in the professional sense, like systems administrators, maintaining websites, maintaining multi-user systems like small business or whatever, will have and use this tool.
Okay, so what percentage of computer professionals would you say, use wget in the course of their work?
I would say almost everybody that uses a Linux machine is going to know about wget or its cousin curl, which is the same thing. There's actually an argument in the computer community about which is better, and I'm a wget person, so.
Okay, so is wget illegal software?
No, ma'am. Yeah, it's in most Linux based installations, and it commonly you can. I think that more recent versions of Windows, the Windows operating system that you have wget on it now. So that wasn't the case in the mid 2000s, but it should have been.
Okay, so at trial. Did the government argue that downloading wget was against the military's acceptable use policy?
Ad nauseum. Yeah.
Okay. And so there was a policy in place, an acceptable use policy.
Yes, and I don't remember signing it, and the government couldn't fund it, but one can assume that I would know what the acceptable use policy is.
Okay, and so there's an acceptable use policy. Despite that policy, did soldiers sometimes download software or other files?
Every day.
Okay, what kind of things?
So we didn't have direct access to the internet. So what you would have done if you want to play a game like Tetris on your computer, there was, I don't even remember the name, but there was this game where there were balls and you could it was like a puzzle game, and there was a bunch of balls and they would move around and there were different colors, and you could get points if you got them in the right row, and they would sort of pop and you'd get points, and that was a pretty popular game. But if you wanted to get that, you would have to go to your computer, download it, and then put it onto a CD and put it onto your computer. And then once it's on there, it was being shared across the network. So it was just flowing. Everybody was using using these tools. I mean, I remember there was a video application called VLC that was, so you could watch videos, but Windows Media Player was what was allowed and installed. But even if you were doing work, there would be encoding problems or issues that Windows Media Player would have. And so even for work purposes, it was not allowed, but people would put VLC so that way they could watch videos. But you could also watch movies on it. You could also watch, there was this common the biggest problem that the S6 shop, which is the military equivalent of your IT, was pirated music and games and video and films were on the network, and I did not have a lot of that, but I did see this pretty regularly. People watching films.
Okay, so when the U.S. government argued that you exceeded authorization, they mean that you downloaded wget in violation of this acceptable use policy.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Were you allowed to make a whistleblower defense at the hearing?
No, ma'am. It was barred before we even started trial. It was public defense was deemed irrelevant. In the pretrial hearings, We argued that it was that we obviously wanted to make the case, but we were shut down before we even started.
Okay. And so to be clear, you were never allowed to adduce evidence about the public interest in the documents that you leaked.
Correct. There is no public interest defense in the U.S. government or in U.S. National security disclosures.
Okay. You had a sentence of 35 years, you said, but the sentence was commuted, which my colleague established. What's your understanding of why your sentence was commuted?
My understanding of why the sentence was commuted was, I can't speculate as to what was going on in President Obama's head when this happened, but he did state publicly that it was an unfair, to use his word, disproportionate sentence. And I think it's one of the most remarkable things about the commutation from my personal perspective is that we asked for 10 years. And he reduced it even lower than that. So we only asked for 10 years.
Thank you. I guess the last questions I want to ask you about are about this process. How would you say these inadmissibility proceedings that have been going on since 2017 in one way or another, how have they affected you? Emotionally, psychologically, financially?
Well, I have many friends in Canada, and I obviously the pandemic has gotten in the way of a lot of this, but certainly in 2018 and 2019, I wanted to visit some friends in Canada, and particularly in Montreal and Vancouver, and I really like Canada, and I want to. I also do speaking, and I do a lot of speaking engagements. Again, in a non-pandemic situation, when travel picks up, and previously, whenever I was able to travel, it was difficult to try to book, universities like McGill University or anything like that, to speak. I also increasingly do computer security consulting. So I'm and I am increasingly in the hardware space. And there's a number of hardware vendors and a number of experts in Canada and a number of conventions that would normally happen in a non-pandemic situation. That I would really like to be able to attend to and not have this. I mean, like I'm just it's been 4 years. I mean, I started this process 4 years ago. I thought I did not expect whenever this started that it would be a 4-year long process, and it's exhausting, and it's just a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
And plus I also have to relive this. I'm just going over stuff that happened a decade ago again.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. I think I don't think I have any further questions, but I'm very grateful. I wonder, Ms. Manning, if you would like to, if we should suggest a break before we go any further. I know that the member might have questions as well, of course, for you, but just looking at the time and given the subject matter we covered, perhaps 5 minutes.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I have no need.
No need then. Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So easy to forget. Let me just double check. Does Council Bloom have any additional questions for your clients?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Do the Ministers' Councils have any want to return on any issues? No?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Just give me a few moments, Ms. Manning, just to check my notes. I'll get back. Council Blue, I'm going to ask you to turn off your microphone. I'm getting some background noise for some reason.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Okay. So, Ms. Manny, I'm just going to go back to a portion of your testimony that you just gave. So your counsel asked you, how did you decide which records to disclose?
Yeah.
And you answered that you had access to all kinds of classified documents, but the ones that you eventually decided to disclose were not the most sensitive, and that you had access to and worked with other documents that you determined should not be disclosed. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes, I would certainly make that distinction personally. And I felt that, particularly given the gravity of some of this information. It's not just statistics. It's like people's lives, and these are things that actually happened, and
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I felt.
My question is more to the effect, without discussing the content of the documents, what would have been a type of document that you felt was not appropriate to disclose?
A document that revealed specific sources or methods of a sensitive nature that we actually used, as opposed to, the stuff that I actually used that to make my assessments and my determinations were I would deem at the time to be extremely sensitive. Although I personally don't think I personally don't think that these kinds of things are I disagree with the government in terms of like how long certain things should be, but at the time certainly some of this information would put people in harm's way, but this is not that kind of information.
Okay, so I understand obviously the government has one position, but I'm trying to understand
it's very hard for me to separate that. Sorry.
Yeah. So I
was the government at one point.
What your logic was at the time. Obviously, we understand that the government may have viewed that differently then and still now, but in your logic at the time, you had access to vast amounts of information from what you've indicated. Mm-hmm. Everything was classified to a certain degree from what you testified today. Mm-hmm. And
not everything. I think only 20 or 30% of the actual. It may be more than that. I don't recall the amount, but certainly the State Department cables were mostly, the vast majority of which were actually unclassified.
Okay. So just then going back to my question again, just trying to understand your testimony. The ones that were actually disclosed, you yourself seem to be saying that you made a determination that mm-hmm. these documents were not of a nature that they needed to be kept from the public.
Correct. Yes,
Some others were, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm trying to, again, you spoke to it briefly. So you indicated that the documents, which in your words revealed sources and methods of what?
So the United States government uses very sensitive sources and methods to obtain information, and it has an agreement with obviously 4 other former Commonwealth countries in terms of like how this is carried out and what these are and how they obtain this information. None of this is that. And I can't get into the
I think we're getting into sensitive territory now, so I don't want to go too far. I think I'm just trying to get a general understanding of what the major distinction was. Was it that some of the information was more of a timely nature, i.e. was actually information that was being used at that particular time, and other information, what you said, historical for events that occurred in the past and that was no longer live or active or used by the people on the, you called it in the theater or on the ground or in the field. Again,
Yes,
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm trying to just understand it on a very basic level.
Yes. So at the time, I felt like these were historical. Like there was a distinction between like, oh, this is historical information. These are historical records, as like significant activities in particular were widely viewed as historical records after about 96 hours, right? So, maybe hot at the time whenever units are still there on the ground and still collecting information, and it's still coming live through the BFT, the Blue Forest Tracker. But when after a few weeks, it just is something that happened in the past and isn't relevant to anything ongoing. Is I think the determination that was made, and all the stuff had been was starting to be dated from our perspective, and around this time. So none of the stuff is like hot live now.
So would you say that the information that was live or hot, as you termed it, if it was revealed at the time, could have been harmful?
Immediately within 12 to 24 hours, I would say most of this information had 48 hours of value, of like sensitive value. So I would say that the very rare, maybe one or two categories of this maybe had a sensitivity slightly longer, maybe a week or 2 weeks, but no more than that. I can't. And again, this is my own personal assessment based on why this is not the U.S. government's position, but I certainly felt that this information lost its value at a maximum. Absolute maximum of 2 weeks. Vast majority is 48 hours.
When you were downloading the information, so the actual computers at your workstation, when you were retrieving the information, I think you said that you put it on a DVD at one point.
Yes, ma'am.
There's no, is there a mechanism for the network or the system, the network, I guess, to be alerted to the fact that someone is downloading information off the system?
It's recorded. So information that's downloaded over the network is often recorded. And we had an S6 shop, which was our IT equivalent, who could review what was happening on the network. But there's no every single person is assigned. I was assigned multiple workstations, and that would rotate through that because we had computer issues. It was a deployed environment. Computers would overheat. They'd be exposed to the huge amount of dust in the air. So it was not uncommon for us to go through 2 or 3 laptops in a 6-month period. Before they would have to be shipped off and replaced. But every single computer in our shop had an assigned IP address, and what could be. Everybody had had username, and then there was some common workspace computers, so that multiple people could use. There's a lot of different ways in which the information's just sort of collected, but it wasn't consistent.
Okay, but my question is more: if someone inserts an external device into the laptop and starts copying information on it, the system doesn't freeze or jam or something. I mean, I'm sorry.
No, they added that specifically because of this case.
But I'm asking if something would happen to say, okay, there's an unauthorized access here.
No, none of that stuff existed then. In fact, I think all of it was created because of my case.
Okay. I want to go back to one of the documents that we referred to this morning. So it's Exhibit C7, which is going back to the Court of Appeals decision. So at page 6 of the decision, so this is the paragraph that was referred to earlier that starts off with this morning when the Minister's Council was asking you about your communication with, well, here it refers specifically to Wikileaks leader Julian Assange. So the first sentence talks about that you would have asked him for help in bypassing the security system, and you already testified to the effect that you had access to that system and did not need to ask for help or ask anyone outside the military for access. The next line says, on 7 March 2010, appellant asked Assange about the value of the U.S. and then talks about specific information. Specific detainee assessment memoranda. So we won't get into the details, but this is, and then it says later on, Assange indicated the reports would be valuable. So did this occur?
I'm sorry.
Did you ask Assange about the value of certain information?
I don't know who I was talking to, but okay. I definitely had a lot of banter. There was a lot of side banter in these chat logs. There was a lot of these were kind of how I talk, which is like.
Okay. Well, can you explain if again? I know you're saying you don't know who you were speaking to, but
right.
Was there a chat where there was a question about the value of certain information and a reply indicated that this type of information would be valuable? And if so, what exactly does that mean? What does value?
I mean, it means that I'm trying to determine whether or not they're going to publish.
Okay.
Because I want to get the information published, and I want to make sure that that whoever is on the other end is actually going to publish the stuff and takes it seriously.
So value is in relation to publication. Would it
Absolutely.
be valuable for you to publish this information? Okay.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Like, I want, in that time frame, I want people to disclose. I mean, to publish this stuff. And I was incredibly frustrated with how long it was taking and how many problems I was having and how few people seemed to take me seriously. And I became increasingly frustrated with people not taking the stuff seriously. And, so I want to know if the person who I'm asking to publish something is serious about whether or not they're going to publish something or not. So, that is, I had this problem with Washington Post. I had this problem with the New York Times obviously having just, so many problems with the New York Times. And then I was very concerned. And I had this problem with whoever I was talking to. I was concerned because I was worried that the people that I was talking to, whoever it was not going to take the stuff seriously and was not going to publish this information. Like, there was literally nobody on the face of the earth that was going to stop me, though.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. You never received any financial compensation from WikiLeaks in regards to the information you provided? Okay.
No, I wouldn't dare accept anything like that.
Okay. I think those are all my questions. Just let me take one last look. Okay, I think that's it for me. I guess now would be if there's no further questions from Ms. Manning, I believe that concludes her testimony for now, and we can take a short break at this time. Let's just decide before we do that what the next step will be. My assumption is that council's wish to call Professor Matthews. Chances are we'll probably only get through part of her testimony today, and then likely we'll have to continue, from what I understand, tomorrow afternoon. Is that correct, Council Bloom?
That's correct. She's teaching in the morning, but is available at 1:30 if we need her tomorrow.
Okay, and in regards to the video, you had mentioned wanting to show it, is it prior to her testimony or during her testimony?
So it's kind of a MS Teams technical capacity question. We've tested it out and we think we're going to be able to show it and have it work. So we would like to have her introduce it and then show it during her testimony.
Okay, very well. So let's take a break. Let's see here. Has she been provided with the link? Is she linking in herself? Is that what you've arranged?
Yes, I've provided the link. If we just give her a time, she'll be there.
Let's take a 15-minute break. You can advise her that we're ready for her testimony, and she can connect to the conference. Excuse me, and we'll resume at let's say 2:50, 2:55 at the very latest. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please remember stopping the recording. So please mute your microphones. Thank you. Counsel Bloom, I don't see your witness connected yet. Has she been asked to call in or to connect?
She has. I told her 2:55, so
Okay.
it may be any moment now.
That's fine. I'm just going to ask you once she's been sworn in, if you could please just briefly, at the outset of her testimony, go over her field of expertise, qualifications, and then,
Yeah,
detail, but just the basics so we can properly identify her and her field of expertise.
absolutely.
I believe she's connecting now. Won't be long. Good afternoon, Dr. Matthews. Can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. My name is Member Musto. I'm a member at the Immigration Division of the Immigration and Refugee Board. Thank you for being with us today. You've been called as a witness in the admissibility proceeding of Chelsea Manning. And you've been called by her counsels, Counsel Bloom and Gill. So we have already received and entered into evidence a report authored by you. Just so I'm clear, do you prefer to be called Dr. Heidi Matthews or Professor Heidi Matthews for the purposes of this proceeding?
Professor is fine. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so Professor Matthews, as I said, you are being called by counsel as an expert witness, so counsel will likely be asking you some questions at the beginning of your testimony to explore your field of expertise. I will still place you under oath. Do you solemnly declare to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, just for the benefit of the other parties, as I mentioned at the outset of the proceedings, I am reserving my qualification of Professor Matthews as an expert witness until such time as I can properly analyze the evidence and information in her report and her testimony today. The parties are invited at that time to also give their submissions on her expertise in the subject at hand. If for whatever reason I come to the conclusion that she is not to be considered an expert, I can still consider her testimony as that of an ordinary witness. So I guess I'm not sure, is it Counsel Bloom or Counsel Gill who will be leading the questions for this witness?
I will be doing the questions for Professor Matthews.
Counsel Bloom will begin. So Professor Matthews, I probably you've already been informed, we will likely not have time to complete your testimony today. If that is the case, we will invite you to return tomorrow afternoon, which I believe is when you will next be available. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, very well. So let's try to get as far as we can today. Like I said this morning, I think 4:30 is really the maximum time we can expect to all last till, given we've been here since 9 o'clock this morning. But what we'll do is around 4 o'clock, we'll gauge the situation and we'll see where we're at. Okay? So please go ahead, Counsel Bloom, whenever you're ready. I'll ask all the other parties to please mute your microphones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for being here, Professor Matthews. I'm going to start with some questions about your expertise in international humanitarian law, and particularly as it applies in the war on terror. So I'll start first with just very basic questions. What is your current position at Osgoode Hall Law School?
I'm an assistant professor of law at Osgoode.
And what are the areas?
I apologize, Mr. Bloom. I think the volume for you, Professor Matthews, is quite low. I'm not sure if you're able to adjust anything on your end.
Okay. It's just speaking up. Does that assist?
That's better. That's better.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I'm not sure. Maybe sometimes I know when witnesses wear earphones, they sometimes mute the sound a little bit. But if you can just speak up a little more, it's very helpful. Thank you.
No matter how many times one does these things, there's always an adjustment. Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, was the question what areas do I teach?
Yes.
Thank you. So since joining the faculty at Osgood, I've taught in a number of areas relevant to the case at hand. So those would be international criminal law, which I teach regularly. That field covers, of course, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression, and the international law of terrorism. I also teach international humanitarian law, also sometimes called the law of war or the law of armed conflict. I teach a course on genocide and indigenous peoples. I also teach domestic criminal law and law and sexuality.
And how long have you taught courses on international humanitarian law or international criminal law at Osgood?
Since 2017.
And have you ever taught classes in these subjects prior to joining Osgood?
I have, yeah. I guess I've been teaching in the area for about a decade. So during my time as a doctoral candidate, I served as a vice fellow at the Harvard Law School, teaching a course on the so-called new discourse of war in the 21st century. I served as a teaching fellow in the undergraduate program at Harvard University, as well in courses relating to armed conflict, genocide, and gender. During my time as a postdoctoral fellow at the British Academy in London, I also taught at the SOAS School of Law in cognate areas.
And have you either published or given academic conference presentations on areas related to the law of war?
Yes, I have several book chapter publications relating to international criminal law, particularly relevant here, the law of terrorism internationally, and I've given, of course, numerous scholarly and public talks in the area as well.
Do you conduct peer review, or are you involved in any scholarly journals who publish on this subject matter?
I am. I sit on the editorial board of the German Law Journal, which regularly covers questions of international law, specifically, of course, the law of war and international criminal law.
And have you ever done research related to the war on terror?
Yes. So my graduate research focused heavily on the war of terror as it relates to questions of international criminal law, and also the evolving discourse and doctrine of counterinsurgency from the period basically of 2007 until now. And so, as noted in my CV and also in the report, my LLM thesis focused heavily on the development of counterinsurgency doctrine, looking at the particular question of the way in which this new doctrine and practice actually worked to blur the distinction between civilians and combatants, which of course is one of the cardinal principles of the law of war. I'm sure we'll talk more about that over the course of the testimony. And then my doctoral dissertation itself took a legal, historical, as well as political, theoretical approach to the long history of international criminal law, which of course heavily involves the law of terror and its treatment from an international legal perspective.
Thank you. Do you have any prior relationship with Ms. Manning?
No, I don't.
Have you ever written in any form about her case?
No, I have not.
Do you understand the role of an expert witness in this proceeding?
I do, yes.
And do you accept that role?
I do.
I'm going to move on to the subject matter, but I would ask Madam Member if there are any other questions about qualifications you would like me to pose.
I don't have any questions. I'll see if the minister has any questions regarding qualification that they wish to pose immediately. If not, I'll allow Council Bloom to go ahead.
We do have questions, and
do you want to ask them now, or do you want Council Bloom to go ahead and you ask them on counter? Which do you prefer?
We could ask now. It's a very short question.
Yeah. So go ahead, Council Bloom. No objection to Minister asking their questions on specifically on qualification, of course.
No objection.
Okay, go ahead, please, Ministers' Council.
Yes. Professor Matthews, have you ever been qualified as an expert witness before?
No.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you very much. All right, so Council Bloom, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead with your questions. Professor Matthews, I'll just invite you to please keep in mind to try to speak up a little bit. There's a bit of background noise that might interfere, so I'm just going to be ask you to be mindful about the volume. Thank you so much. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. So, Professor Matthews, you described some of your graduate work on counterinsurgency in the War on Terror, and I'm just going to ask a couple questions about that. So I'll begin here. Could you please just define COIN, or what counterinsurgency means for us?
Yeah, sure. So counterinsurgency is, of course, not referring to a body or a corpus of law in any traditional sense. It refers instead to military strategy and the corpus of tactics that may be involved in unfolding that particular strategy. It has a long history in the law of war, dealing essentially with what we would refer to as low intensity or internal conflict situations, where you're dealing with an insurgency, which could basically involve irregular non-state groups seeking to use political violence to affect political change, sometimes going so far as to try to affect regime change. And so we see counterinsurgencies in its previous historical iterations in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, for example. But the way counterinsurgency was waged in the past has been presented in the context of evolving strategy, primarily by the United States, but also NATO and other coalition forces, in sort of a new and reformed light in the post-2007 era. So basically, what we have today is this idea that there's a new, reformed, more humane way of doing counterinsurgency that has learned from the lessons, purportedly, of the past, and that now takes a more civilian protection, human rights orientated approach. And so that's the theory.
Understood. And you state in your report that Ms. Manning's disclosures, quote, lifted the veil on this new form of counterinsurgency. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think now that, in the context of a decade or so since the documents were revealed to the public, we're able to see even more clearly now, I think, but clearly at the time, but even more clearly now, the salience from the perspective of both public interest in ensuring democratic accountability for political violence waged in the name of citizens of Western liberal democracies, but certainly also just the idea that what we were being told through the official COIN doctrine and through the really intense celebration of that doctrine, both within the American sort of military context, but also, intriguingly, within the legal human rights sphere, we see that actually was a false picture. And so what I mean by that is that the details revealed in really all of the different tomes or caches or whatever we want to call them, the headings of the documents, all of the different ones that were released contain serious and credible reasons to really question on an intense level the degree to which the orthodox story being told to the public, as well as to the legal community, about the sort of kinder, gentler, newer way of waging war in the context of the so-called war on terror did not track what was happening on the ground, and that the reality was far more brutal, far more destructive, and far more problematic, again, both from a political perspective and also a legal perspective.
Right. And so specifically as a matter of law, you said this in your report, this new form of counterinsurgency blurred the principle of distinction. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah. So when I talk about counter, and this is in the report, but just to refresh, and particularly if folks still need to read it in detail, what I'm referring to specifically is the doctrine as it was enunciated in the context of the 2007 U.S. Army and Marine Field Manual on counterinsurgency. Okay, so that's the document that I'm drawing on here primarily when I'm describing that. So, I'm so sorry. What was I'm trying to just ask you to restate the original question.
Sure. So you stated that this new form of warfare blurred the principle of distinction. Yeah. So can you tell us what the principle of distinction is and what this blurring was? Yeah.
So in the context of the document that I've referred to, right, what we see consistently is this talk about changing the center of gravity in the new warfare away from traditional, highly kinetic, highly violent, kill and capture orientated tactics toward what's referred to as civilian protection as the primary goal, as well as clear and hold tactics. So the idea is very much that at root, that the less civilian destruction that is affected in the context of a counterinsurgent operation over time, of course, will convince the civilian population to accept the political purpose and commitments of the counterinsurgent force and reject the grievances of the insurgent force. So what counterinsurgency does is it turns away from the traditional conception of military necessity in the law of war as focused around the destruction and weakening of opposing military forces, and turns instead to the question of securing, protecting, and focusing on the civilian population, and relatedly, this broader question of nation building, civilian support, etc. So it turns a primarily military operation into a much broader project that's focused on nation building, on transition to democracy as and where appropriate, securing economic development goals, etc. So the reason this blurs the fundamental tenet of the law of war, which is the principle of distinction that you talked about, is because it turns the focus in the military campaign away from the enemy combatants, as they were referred to in the course of this war, however we want to talk about them, right? Basically the enemy. It turns the focus away from the enemy and toward the civilian population, which in practice, what we see over the course of the last 20 years of the war, and certainly in the aftermath of the unrolling of the new doctrine, is very much at this kind of turn to civilianness actually had counterintuitive effects, right? So when you're focusing on the civilian population in the context often of urban warfare, but also in Afghanistan where it wasn't always urban, of course, what you're dealing with is really turning away from the goal that the law of war directs you to attend to. And so you're in a situation where you're constantly, as a counterinsurgent force, dealing with the civilian population in ways that may not always be salutary. And I think the effects and the content of what we see in the leaked documents confirms this sense that we've turned with COIN, or counterinsurgency, toward focusing on the civilian in an unauthorized and destructive sense.
Thank you. So I do want to talk about one example where we see kind of an example of counterinsurgency in practice in a very destructive way. I want to talk about the collateral murder video, what WikiLeaks termed the collateral murder video. So I'd like to just start by introducing the kind of context of the video. So first, can you explain for us what this video depicts factually?
Yeah. So the video depicts what ends up being the killing of approximately 11 people, including 2 Reuters journalists. They were cameramen working for Reuters. It takes place in the Al Amin neighborhood of Baghdad in 2007. There are 2 strikes that I believe you're going to show in the video. The second strike also ends up critically injuring 2 children as well. So I'm not sure if you want me to get into more concrete detail about that, but I'm happy to do so.
Just could you tell us who are the people we're going to see in the video?
Right. So you're going to hear the crew of the helicopter that ends up performing the 2 strikes. You're going to hear them talking with a military lawyer who authorizes the strikes. You're going to see folks on the ground, several of whom allegedly are insurgents. We don't really have definitive evidence as to whether or not that's the case, although in the aftermath of the attack, we do know that some AK-47s and an RPG allegedly were recovered. You're going to see the 2 Reuters journalists in question. You're going to see a van that turns out to be an Iraqi civilian Good Samaritan who will come to the rescue of the journalists and the alleged insurgents after the first strike happens. And I don't believe you'll actually see the children's bodies or anything like that, but they are there as well.
Thank you. So I think my co-counsel will now share her screen and we'll play the beginning about 9 minutes of the video and then another minute in. It's a 39-minute video total, and we're playing just these excerpts that have the relevant events.
If you'll allow me, Council Bloom, I'm realizing that I believe this morning I mistakenly referred to this video with the name collateral damage instead of collateral murder because I'm looking at my notes, so I apologize for that. So I'll just restate that Exhibit P52 is a video referred to as with the title of collateral murder and not collateral damage, as I had previously stated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone see my screen now? The full window?
Yes.
Yes, we can see them.
I can see it.
Yes.
Is there sound? Because I don't hear anything yet.
Do you hear the sound?
I can't hear anything.
Okay, I'll turn up the sound. I'll make sure that I believe the sound should be playing. I'll just double check that. I'm going to stop sharing, start sharing again. Okay. Sound?
Last calling station, Hotel 26. Hotel 26, this is Round. You want your hotel CCL? And a black vehicle on target, right to the north of the mosque. Yeah, I would like that, over. Moving south by the mosque dome on that road. a guy with a weapon. Roger. There's a 4-5. 6, not that way, 6. This location, and there's more that keep walking by, and one of them has a weapon. Roger, receive target. Okay. 208. See all those people standing down there? Right. Okay, firm. And open courtyard. Yeah, Roger. I just estimate there's about 20 of them. There's, yeah. Oh, yeah. I got radio 6-1. Or, correct. Vantage on 4 route 236. I don't know if that's... Bushman's element. Copy that white 6. That's a weapon. Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. We'll call for change by Charlie Mike Bravo. Speed 37. Number red white 6. Bushman's 6 Romeo. Roger. Fucking break. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have individuals with weapons. 4 radio. Real Banners 14. Yep, he's got a weapon too. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s. Request permission to engage. Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position. So, you are free to engage over. Alright, we'll be engaging. Roger, go ahead. I can't get them now because they're behind that building. Any business element? Call by one. Negative. He was right in front of the Brad. About there 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then. Just fucking. Once you get on, just open off. Roger. Yeah. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this. You're clear. All right, firing. Line here. With the state line. Let me know when you have it. We'll shoot. Light them all up. 002 traffic 260. Come on, fire. Yeah, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot. Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now. Alright, we just engaged all 8 individuals. Yeah, we got 2 birds. We're still firing. Roger. Got him. 6 is a 2-6. We're moving. We got 15. I'm sorry. Well, bypass. God damn it, Kyle. Sorry. I hit him. Alright, you're clear. Alright, I'm just trying to find targets again. Bushmaster 6 is a Bushmaster 2-6. Got a bunch of bodies laying there. Alright, we got about 8 individuals. Yeah, we got 1 guy crawling around down there, but yeah, we definitely got some. Or shooting some more. Roger. Hey, you shoot, I'll talk. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Crazy Horse 18, this is Hotel 26, over. Roger, currently engaging approximately 8 individuals, KIA, RPGs, and AK-47s. Hotel 26, you need to move to that location once Crazy Horse is done and get pictures, over. Circuit 20 is the location. The Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards. Nice. 26, Crazy Horse 18. Negative, Spear 02 in flight. Free change, zone 4 at this time. Spear 02, free change. Nice. Good shoot. Thank you. Hotel 26. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Crazy Horse 18, Bushmaster 7, go ahead. Yeah, Bushmaster 7, Crazy Horse 18. Location of bodies, Mike Bravo, 54588617. Hey, good on the kitchen, that's good. 54588617, over. It's Crazy Horse 18, that's a good copy. They're on a street in front of an open courtyard with a bunch of blue trucks, a bunch of vehicles in the courtyard. them down so they can hurry up, get over here. It's 1-8. We also have one individual, appears to be wounded, trying to crawl away.
Roger. We're going to move down there.
Roger, we'll cease fire. We won't shoot anymore. He's getting up. If he has a weapon in his hand? No, I haven't seen one yet. You guys got that guy crawling right now on the curb? Yeah, I got him. I put 2 rounds near him, and you guys are shooting over there too, so we'll see. Yeah, roger that.
Bushmaster 36 Element, this is Hotel 27, over.
Hotel 27, Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, I'm just trying to make sure that you guys have my turb, over.
Roger, we got you.
Come on, buddy. I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
Crazy Horse, this is Bushmaster 5. So Bushmaster 4, break. Here, right below you, right time now. Can you walk us onto that location, over?
This is 2-6, Roger. I'll pop flares. We also have one individual moving. We're looking for weapons. If we see a weapon, we're going to engage. Now, Bushmaster, we have a van that's approaching and picking up the bodies. Where's that van at? Right down there by the body. Okay, yeah. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene. Looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons. I mean,
hey, we need to stop that so we can get down there. We need to stop that. You see my look?
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1-8. Request permission to engage. I'm picking up the wounded. Yeah, we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let us shoot. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8. You're taking him. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8.
This is Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black bongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
1-8, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear. Clear. We're engaged. Coming around, clear. Roger. Trying to, clear. Roger, I lost him in the dust. I got him. I'm firing.
George, this is Bushmaster 4. You got any BDA on that truck, over?
You're clear. This is Crazy Horse, stand by. I'm shooting for some reason. Go ahead. I think the van's disabled. Let's shoot it. I got an azimuth limit for some reason. Left. Clear left. Alright, Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8. A vehicle appears to be disabled. There was approximately 4 to 5 individuals in vehicle moving bodies. Your lead, Bradley, should take the next right. That's cruising east down the road. No more shoot.
Just gonna skip forward because the interest of time, essentially. Start it here.
Can you pause for just a few moments before you continue playing the video? I just want to look at something quickly. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, you can go ahead. Thank you, Counsel.
We'll just play another minute or so.
Roger. Want me to take over talking now? Bravo 7. Go ahead. 76 on the 11. Roger, I've got 11 Iraqi KIAs, 1 small child wounded, over. But, damn. Oh well. Roger, we need a evac this child. She's got a wound to the belly. I can't do anything here. She needs to get evac. Go ahead. Bushmaster 7, Bushmaster 7, this is Bushmaster 6 from here. We need your location, over. Roger, we're at the location where Crazy Horse engaged the RPG fire break.
Forward, right.
Grid 5458. It's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle. That's right.
We can stop it there. You done screen sharing? Yeah.
Yes, fine. Thank you.
Yes.
Continue with
Thank
your
you.
for Professor Matthews.
Thank you. So, Professor Matthews, does this video conform to the U.S. government's position on these events prior to its release?
No. Simply. There are two elements to that answer, I think. The first being that proximate to the attacks, the military released statements to the media indicating that there had been 11 insurgents killed, 2 Reuters journalists, and 2 children injured. But they had, in the course of that media release, had stated that those injuries and deaths ensued in the course of an active firefight. So what's going on there is we find out later, once this video comes to light and there's increased public interest in the case, that actually there had been an altercation with insurgents in the area earlier in that morning, but that it was temporally quite removed from the attacks that we just looked at. And you can see, we watched the beginning of the video. What we see are the individuals actually walking down the road in a sort of a peaceful manner, no indication at all that they were posing an active threat. Certainly no indication that what happened was in the context of a response to active hostility, certainly not a firefight. That same day, when Reuters employees sought to get more information, essentially, from the military about what had happened to their colleagues, and of course at the same time were then tasked with reporting on the deaths of their colleagues in real time. We're told that same information, that what had happened had been in the course of a firefight, that this was basically unfortunate, what we would call colloquially collateral damage. We'll talk about legally what that means later on, I imagine. And so it was portrayed as sort of an accidental byproduct of warfare that can happen and that doesn't amount to any sort of a violation of the law of war and certainly wouldn't amount to an international crime. So that's the first portion. The second part of that is once we see so once we compare the video to the official investigation that the military undertook in the aftermath of the report, we see that there are clear anomalies, so the two don't line up, essentially. There are several things to be said there, but one critical point was that the investigation, which ended up clearing the crew of any wrongdoing in affecting those two targeting actions and decisions, cleared them of any wrongdoing and actually reversed a couple of onuses that are important in the context of evaluating the legality of a targeting decision. But before we get to that question, critically, even the official investigation released by the military omits to note that the authorization to engage in the first attack was actually, so before the van arrives, the first armed attack was actually given before the helicopter crew notices one of the Reuters journalists crouching behind a building, and they say their perception was that the camera that he was carrying was a weapon, specifically an RPG, and that he was behaving in an erratic and suspicious manner, specifically by raising his camera to take several photos. Their impression, according to the official story, was that he was raising the camera to shoot an RPG. So while that would lend certainly an air of plausibility to the story that what happened was an unfortunate accident in the course of urban warfare, what we see in the video is actually that the authorization to shoot was given before that happened. So again, there's much more we can say about this particular video, but those are some critical points.
You're muted.
You alluded to the legality of the strike, but what would international law have to say about the first strike?
So, of course, it's not for me to take the position of what a competent court would end up finding as to the legality of this strike, right? But what I can do is reflect on the applicable law and some of the points that a competent finder of fact would be tasked with determining in this case. So the first thing to note is that at this time, the conflict in Iraq was classed as a non-international armed conflict. I'm not sure what everyone's competency is in the classification of armed conflicts, but the short story in that complex area of law is to say that a non-international armed conflict involves a state interacting in an armed capacity with irregular insurgent or non-state forces, and so not a state-on-state conflict. And so that means that the applicable rules are somewhat different when it would come to evaluating the legality of targeting decisions. But the key takeaway there is that Common Article 3, as it's referred to, that means the third article, which is common to the 4 Geneva Conventions from 1949, so it's reproduced the same text in each convention. That is the applicable law here. So barring all other questions of whether or not, X, Y, and Z may or may not apply, the real core penumbrum, or whatever you want to call it, right, the real center and the sort of minimum basic set of rules that apply in all armed conflicts, including non-international armed conflicts, is Common Article 3 and is without any question applicable in the context of the strikes that we just witnessed. So Common Article 3 incorporates the principle of distinction that we've talked about a little bit. The principle of distinction is a long-standing principle in the law of war, going back, many centuries now, perhaps nearly 200 years. But critically, it is taken by most scholars and lawyers to really be the center of the law of war. And it's incorporated in the context of the language of Common Article 3. It's obvious to see that if you take a look at the context of that article. And it's the position of the International Committee of the Red Cross as well, that the principle of distinction is incorporated in the operation of Article 3, namely because it wouldn't really make sense in Common Article 3 to focus on protecting civilians, or in the language that's used by the article, persons that are taking no active part in hostilities. It would be impossible to ensure their humane treatment and protection were the principle of distinction not incorporated into that article. So that's that is very uncontroversial in the context of the law of war. So the principle of distinction entails several duties on the parts of combatants. It means that there's a responsibility on the part of combatants, so we're talking about American forces here, to make all feasible efforts to distinguish between civilians and combatants. So we're looking in the context of the video at a group of alleged insurgents, and then of course 2 journalists, and ultimately a Good Samaritan and his 2 children. Part of the duty, so then the practical question is, well, what does that actually mean in the context of urban warfare like this? It means a few things, and these are, again, well established in customary international law as requirements attaching to Common Article 3. It means that armed forces are required to take feasible precautions under the circumstances to distinguish between civilians and combatants. So we can talk about how that rolls out in the context of both Strike 1 and Strike 2. And there's also correlatively the obligation that any civilian harm occasioned as a result of a strike must be proportionate. And so again, this is this concept of collateral civilian damage. And the basic idea is that collateral damage or civilian harm should not be expected to have been excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated by the strike. So that's kind of the bare bones of the governing framework in question here. I'm happy to work through those elements as it would be helpful to the member and others. Oh, I think you're muted.
Could I ask you to just apply it to the second strike on the van?
Sure, yeah. So I think one obvious way in which these various duties were not adhered to on my reading and on many scholarly readings, I think it's fair to say that the vast and overwhelming scholarly assessment of this video would be to say that there is serious evidence of breaches of international humanitarian law, potentially giving rise to individual criminal responsibility here. That's because what we see in particular is that no precautions have been taken in the context of a situation where after the first strike, everybody's on the ground. 2 individuals appear to be alive, but also appear to be severely injured. And then a van arrives. Of course, it's not possible for the helicopter crew to know exactly who's in the van, right? Could have been insurgents, they don't know. But there was no necessity at that point in time to violently engage the van and the 2 injured individuals. So possible alternatives that are outlined, for example, in the Department of Defense Law of War Manual include things like delaying or shifting the timing of an attack, so choosing not to attack in that precise moment, but instead waiting some time to seek further information or clarity as to the details of the situation. As well, warning shots would be a very obvious way of avoiding taking what ends up to be lethal action here, and was, of course, intended, as we saw, to be lethal action. There's also a principle. I would say that there is some debate in the scholarly community around this principle, but there is at least a strong and emerging principle that international humanitarian law would prohibit manifestly unnecessary killing. And so what that means is that there may be an obligation to capture wounded folks as opposed to kill them. So this is the capture versus kill debate. But in the context, what I would say, though, in the context of counterinsurgency doctrine and strategy, as I've described it, not taking precautionary measures and deciding to use lethal force where there's no imminent threat, danger, or evidence of hostility on the part of the injured person would, I think, be concerning to anybody who's seeking to make sense of how a doctrine and an approach to war that is supposed to privilege civilian protection then gets operationalized in practice. And so if you look back to the text of the field manual, what it talks about is this requirement on the part of counterinsurgents to accept more risk in situations like this than they would under ordinary or more traditional, more kinetic, non-counterinsurgency theaters of operation, right? So that would mean it would be incumbent upon the helicopter crew in this situation to not resort immediately to using lethal force. Firstly, in the context of no actual evidence of an urgent and imminent threat, but certainly in the context of, again, counterinsurgency principles around civilian protection as well. It's also a rule of international humanitarian law that one is not to target, and again, this emerges from the text and the development of Common Article 3. It's a violation of Common Article 3 to target individuals who have been rendered hors de combat, which means placed outside of combat by reason of sickness, detention, etc., but also by reason of having been wounded. And so there is an exception to that rule if if a wounded combatant is trying to escape, that protection no longer applies, but is also a relevant consideration here as well, given the extent of the wounds that we saw in the video.
Thank you. So just thinking back to your discussion earlier on of counterinsurgency during the War on Terror, what do you make of the comment at the very end of the video? They quote, "They shouldn't have brought their kids to a battlefield."
Yeah, I mean, I think any reasonable person would find that to be alarming thing to listen to. I'm not sure there'd be much disagreement among any of us in the room, virtual room. It certainly indicates a level of callousness and disregard for human life that, again, is not in accordance with the method and strategy of warfare as set out in Coin Strategy and as publicly celebrated and touted by the military, U.S. military and coalition forces. I would say that the statement, though, it presents a false dichotomy also, because we're not dealing with a traditional battlefield, and that's certainly apparent and obvious to anybody who is involved either as an insurgent or a counterinsurgent at that point in time. This is not a traditional battlefield in the sort of 19th century idealized sense of warfare, or even in the 21st century state-on-state warfare context. So there's no sense in which urban counterinsurgent warfare is a battlefield in any traditional sense. That would have been known to the folks making the statement, which lends credence to the thought, to this conclusion, as I said, that they're creating, it seems to me that a false dichotomy is being created both to deride the folks who have been made subject to the attacks, to make light of what has happened, possibly, as well as to sort of create a sense of faultlessness or blamelessness or maybe even moral superiority on the part of the counterinsurgents in the video. And so, it would be easy to invert the statement and say, well, perhaps counterinsurgents shouldn't take the battlefield to a neighborhood.
Thank you. So I want to turn now to some of the other disclosures. We'll start with the Afghan war logs. And how does what we see in the video we just watched compare to the information in larger disclosures like the Afghan war logs?
I have a cold. I'm just going to wipe my nose for 1 second. Hang on. It's not COVID, but it's very, very bad cold. Sorry about that. So, yeah, the question is about, the question really asks, right, like, is this video an aberration in the context of a larger war effort that may have actually been quite different? Are we looking at bad apples or bad actors operating in a sort of exceptional way that doesn't align with the way that the so-called war on terror had been prosecuted in other theaters? And so that, of course, involves the theater of Afghanistan, also really a global theater insofar as targeted killings and drone strikes are being carried out in multiple places all over the planet to this day. So the Afghan war logs, part of what they do is they confirm some of the statements I've already made, and certainly many suspicions from folks who were watching the war on terror closely as it was rolling out at this time, that actually the civilian toll and the degree to which civilians were made to suffer in pursuit of the war in its various theaters was far more serious and severe, again, than the military was formally releasing or admitting to. And again, that applies not just to the American military, but also to the British military, Australian, Canadian military as well, right? So to all of the coalition forces in that context. So obviously it was outside of the scope of my report to be able to detail in any sort of exhaustive fashion the contents of the documents. There are just many, many, many thousand, obviously, documents revealed, and it would be impossible for me to go through them in an exhaustive way. But what I've tried to do is to talk about, again, specific instances and general conclusions as well, to sort of marry those two aspects together to be able to draw larger conclusions that reflect my own professional judgment as well as the scholarly consensus in the area. So one example that I talk about in the report of an instance that actually was later judged to not have complied with the dictates of international humanitarian law in the context of Afghanistan, involved a massacre that had happened at a village called Nagar Kale. I wonder whether I'm saying that right, but it's in the report. And that was in 2007, and it involved coalition troops. So specifically Polish troops who had gone to this village, and during the course of a wedding party, ended up launching mortar fire and killing several civilians. And it turned out that there was significant evidence to show that there was no insurgent threat present at the time of the attack. The attack was not responding to any acts of violence or hostility. And in fact, what was happening was that Polish forces were exacting what's known as a reprisal attack against the civilian population in response to an earlier attack against Polish forces in the area. So this ended up getting litigated eventually in the courts in Poland. And it turns out that the individuals in question were prosecuted for obeying essentially an illegal order. Scholars have looked at that case and complained that it didn't go far enough on the basis that there was evidence of other concrete violations of Common Article 3, but it is an example. Sorry, did you want to interject?
No.
Okay.
No, thank you. Please continue.
Sure. Just going to open up the report to make sure I'm not losing track of where I am, if that's all right. The other main takeaway, again, we're going to keep coming back to this question of proportionality and distinction over and over again, because it's the main animating principle of the law of war, and because basically some of the most significant impacts of the leaks, specifically in the context of the Afghanistan war diaries, were insofar as they revealed, again, evidence of indiscriminate and potentially also disproportionate targeting of civilians. And I would say, I would note, and this is explained in the report, but just to note that proportionality as a requirement attaches not just to specific targeting decisions or specific violent altercations that are limited in time, but also attaches as a requirement to the broader war effort. And so not only are we seeing with revelations of massive civilian casualties on a level much greater than had been formally recognized or admitted to on the part of both American and coalition forces, that gives concern about the legality of specific targeting decisions. It also raises kind of the larger specter that the resort to force itself in these various theaters, namely Iraq and Afghanistan taken together, was far less legitimate politically and morally, and also legally. So that's kind of the broad takeaway with respect to the level of civilian casualty and why that's important. And then just to clue that up, other common ways in which this played out on the ground were uses of force in the context of roadblocks and checkpoints that were very often resulted in high civilian casualty levels. The choice to engage lethal force was taken often in the absence of concrete evidence of any hostility, and certainly often, again, without taking the sorts of feasible precautionary measures which would have been arguably available at the time. And so things like firing warning shots.
Thank you. And your report also discusses the Iraq war logs and found that these documents also provide their own evidence of likely breaches of the law. Could you briefly summarize what those violations or abuses were?
Sure. So again, going back to civilian injury and death and this question of proportionality and indiscriminate targeting. So part of what the Iraq war logs revealed, again, putting into question the overall proportionality of the conflict itself, were 15,000 previously unaccounted for civilian casualties. That's a very large number. And it's evidence, very strong evidence, that the United States and coalition forces were not being truthful and transparent and forthcoming about what was happening on the ground in the context of the Iraq War. We obviously know today, and had very significant questions at the time as well, about the overall justification for the resort to force in the context of the Iraq War, namely this idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, etc. I don't need to rehearse the details of that debate. But in the what I would say, though, is that in the context of that larger debate, again, about the legality of the original resort to force, finding out that there are 15,000 unaccounted for civilian casualties is even more impactful from both a public interest and legal perspective as well. The Iraq war logs also reveal striking evidence of systematic abuse and torture practices directly committed by both American and British troops in Iraq, but also committed by Iraqi authorities with knowledge by American and British forces that torture and abuse was happening. And so then there was correlatively a systematic failure on the part of the American government and military to investigate many credible and evidence-supported, including medical evidence, allegations of torture at the hands of the Iraqi military and police forces. So I can talk a bit about why that's illegal. Oh, and also, so relatedly, so U.S. and evidence that the U.S. and the British committed torture and abuse themselves, evidence that they knew about torture and didn't investigate it, and also evidence that Americans and the British transferred detainees to the custody of Iraqi authorities with reasonable knowledge that they would then subject them to torture. So there's sort of three discrete actions involved in the torture and abuse question with respect to detainees. Going back again, sorry, do you want me to continue or?
I think in the interest of time, we have your discussion in the report. I want to just ask you the similar question about the diplomatic cables leak and just what were the most significant violations of international law that you take away from that?
Yeah, so the diplomatic cables leak is a bit of a different beast when it comes to substantively understanding what was revealed and then the significance of those revelations. I'm sorry. So there was a lot revealed in the context of the cables that tells us as members of the public, as legal professionals, and as historians of the law of the war on terror, rather, tells us a lot about U.S. diplomacy in that context, as well as diplomacy and actions on the part of other states. In terms of articulating discrete violations of the law of war, that sort of diplomatic detail doesn't, in most cases, arise to the level of any kind of actual legal violation. But I would just meditate quite briefly on a specific case that's relevant in the Canadian context, relevant in the context of now a long-standing and unresolved conflict and need within Canadian society to understand Canada's role in detainee abuse and torture in the context of the war in Afghanistan. And so I would just note, this is detailed in the report, but of course submissions have been made by lawyers and law professors to the International Court of Justice, documenting substantial evidence of Canadian involvement in abusive, in the transfer of detainees to abusive situations with knowledge of that. And so one example that was revealed of interest in the Canadian context in the cables was this case of Mr. Ismail, who was held without charge, a Canadian citizen, held without charge, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia in Bagram prison under conditions that were described as chronic segregation. Evidence was revealed that the Canadian government knew that this was going on for many, many months. At the same time that human rights watchdogs were calling for attention to allegations of torture and abuse at Bagram prison itself.
Thank you.
Mr. Bloom, Council Bloom, I'll just interject here. It is 4:06 at this time, so I'm not sure how much longer your questioning is. As I said, we'll go till 4:30. I'm going to suggest that we stop at that point. So I'll leave it to you to determine how you want to spend the next 20 minutes or so. If you want to embark on a different subject, continue, or stop here, whatever your decision is. Of course, we will invite Professor Matthews to continue with her testimony tomorrow afternoon. So if you're not done today, you'll be able to continue tomorrow.
Thank you. So I actually was just about to move into my final line of questioning, so I shouldn't be much longer at all. I just have about 3 more questions. So to close, I wanted to just zoom out and ask some more big picture questions. And to summarize, when we look at the respondents' disclosures in their totality, what is the picture that comes across about the war on terror?
Mm-hmm. Some of this I've said already, but so I will try and quickly summarize. The overall picture is of a war that has gotten out of hand, that's cost many trillions of dollars, and that has resulted in many, many thousands of deaths, of both of civilians, but also of combatants, of course, including members of coalition forces. A war that did not appear to have an end, and so it remains the official position of the American government that the authorization of the use of military force promulgated about 20 years ago is still in effect and still justifies an ongoing war on terror. So the war on terror is not over. Some scholars, notably Samuel Moyn, whose new book is causing a stir in the scholarly world as well as the policy and legal world, has made the point that really we cannot expect this forever war, as it's sometimes referred to end at any point soon, and that actually, if anything, has ended up being almost normalized. And we see just the daily and human level reality of what happens on the ground in the context of the war on terror. And I would say that would apply not just from the perspective of the civilian population, suffering under the sorts of violent conditions that we've discussed, but also clearly applies to all of the coalition military service members as well, who, as we know, have suffered considerably from involvement in the war, from PTSD and other factors. And so nothing in my testimony is meant to say that the only people that have suffered here are the civilians on the ground. I think it goes without question to say that everybody has suffered incredibly. And really to show that the language of nation building and civilian protection and humanity and all of this that was core to CORN's strategy and doctrine has not worked and had no prospect of working.
Thank you. So I'll just end here. What impact, if any, would you say that the respondents' disclosures had on accountability for violations of the law that took place during these military actions?
Thank you. This is such a fascinating question for those of us who are studying this war, this endless war. Accountability has been something that's on some levels not present at all, and in other levels beginning to crop up in very, very interesting ways. And so American forces and the American government has until now escaped with total impunity for any violations of the law of war in this context. But that hasn't necessarily been the case in other contexts. And so with respect to British forces and accountability there, again, accountability has been in some ways quite limited, but in other ways there's evidence to show that what was revealed in the leaked documents we're discussing actually created a considerable degree of momentum among the population locally, but also globally and specifically in the human rights community for greater transparency and concrete accountability. Unlike the United States, the United Kingdom has pursued a series of internal investigations into allegations of misconduct and has found that indeed in the context of Iraq there were serious violations that took place. Relatedly, the International Criminal Court has found, the prosecutor of the ICC has found that a reasonable basis to believe that British troops committed international crimes in Iraq, ranging from war crimes to torture to rape and murder. And also at the ICC, on September 27th, so less than 2 weeks ago, the new prosecutor at the ICC, Karim Khan, has asked to on-pause the investigation into alleged criminality in the Afghanistan theater. And the scope of that investigation includes conduct of the U.S. military as well as the CIA. So that's an interesting and very real-time development. And just finally, we didn't talk much about the Guantanamo files, but for anybody listening in the news, the United States Supreme Court had a hearing yesterday in the case of a Guantanamo detainee, Abu Zubaydah, who remains in detention in Guantanamo Bay, has had a habeas corpus petition pending for some 14 years that has not been addressed to date. Polish officials, interestingly, relating this back to the Nagoker massacre, are seeking to pursue accountability for CIA torture that allegedly took place at a black site in Poland before Zubaydah had been transferred then to Guantanamo Bay. It's well known now and incontrovertible that he was subjected to various torture techniques, that he was not a high-level al-Qaeda operative. In fact, he's not an al-Qaeda operative at all, it's my understanding, although he was a jihadist. Was not a high-level operative at all, as the U.S. Had consistently maintained, and that any so-called intelligence he had provided was not useful, really, or reliable in any fashion. And so there's movement in the realm of accountability that has certainly, I think, without question, been strengthened and propelled by Ms. Manning's actions in revealing the documents she did.
Thank you. I would direct all parties to Professor Matthews' report for more of this discussion, but those are all my questions today. Thank you very much, Professor Matthews.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So if that concludes the questions from Council for Ms. Manning, then what we'll do is adjourn now for the day and return tomorrow afternoon for the Ministers' Councils to ask their questions. I understand that 1:30 would be a convenient time for you, Professor Matthews, given that you have presentations in the morning?
It would. I'm teaching earlier in the day. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to confirm with the council that that time is also, as I said, we did have the entire day reserved. I'm assuming everyone is available at 1:30, but please indicate if there's any conflict.
Yeah.
No, everyone's okay with that?
We're available.
Okay. I think we're probably using, if I'm not mistaken, using the same link and the same information. I don't believe there's any difference. Let me just double check, please. Yeah, so it appears that we already have the link, so everyone can just reconvene tomorrow at 1:30 for the continuation of the proceeding. However, I just want to double check with the council. My understanding is that Professor Matthews is the only witness that will be testifying apart from Ms. Manning, of course, and that once she has concluded her testimony, we will be breaking for written submissions. Am I correct in that?
That is our understanding as well.
Minister's Council, same? Okay, very well. Okay, so then we should have definitely sufficient time to conclude tomorrow afternoon then. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Professor Matthews, for being present this afternoon, and we'll see you again tomorrow. And thank you to everyone else for a full day. Thank you, Ms. Manning. We'll see each other again tomorrow. Goodbye. I'll stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Manning, are you okay to start? Do you need a moment to get settled?
No, I'm good. I just had to turn off my phone.
Sure. All right, terrific. So we are on record now. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is the 8th of October, 2021, and this is a continuation of the admissibility proceeding concerning Chelsea Manning. We are continuing again by video conference this afternoon, and it's the same parties that were present at yesterday's proceedings that are present again today. So I am Member Musto. We have Councils Lashley and Barrett for the Minister, and Councils Bloom and Gill for Ms. Manning. And we also have with us Professor Heidi Matthews, who will be continuing her testimony, which we began yesterday. So I'll just indicate again for the record, this is a public proceeding. And as I mentioned yesterday, and I'll repeat again today, we do have a few observers joining us for the proceeding. I will ask all the observers, please, to remain muted and off camera for the entire proceeding. I'll just give them a chance now if anybody's having any issues hearing me properly or whatnot. If you want to unmute your mic and let me know. If not, we'll proceed. Seems everyone's okay? All right. So then where we left off yesterday, I believe it is now the minister's opportunity to question Professor Matthews. So if you could just indicate to me, councils, if it's Meg Barrett or Meg Lashley that will be asking the question this afternoon.
Yes, this is Anthony Lashley. I'll be asking the questions.
Okay, very well. So Professor Matthews, if you just want to unmute your mic, you are still under oath as you were yesterday, and we can continue with your testimony. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. So good afternoon, Professor Matthews.
Hi, good afternoon.
So I have some questions to ask you concerning the expert report that you provided in this file. So my first question, just to give some context, in the end, I'm on the first page, which for us is page 99. At the outset, in the introduction, it states that that you will outline and analyzing the significance of Ms. Manning's disclosures to the Wikileaks organization pertaining to United States, and coalition military activity from the perspective of international law, legal scholarship, and public disclosure more generally. So my first question is, can you give us an idea of how many disclosures, how many files are you consulted in your analysis? I mean specifically the files, as you outset in your introduction, the files pertaining to United States and coalition military activity.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So in answering your question, I'll just summarize. It may be helpful to the parties present. The file headings, let's say, that you've referred to and that I speak about in the report. Member Musto, if or anyone else, if you're having trouble hearing me again today, just let me know.
Professor Matthews, if you just speak up a little bit like you did yesterday, we're fine. If your volume starts to get a bit lower, we have a bit of trouble. So It's fine so far. Thank you.
Wonderful. I just taught for about 3 hours straight, so as long as my voice stays with us, we'll be good. So those documents, the main documents that I was asked in my mandate letter to refer to, and that I do so in the report, relate, of course, to the collateral murder video. That's as it's been known commonly and in the press. We watched, of course, a portion of that video yesterday, and so I reviewed that video in its entirety. The Afghan War Diaries or the Afghan War Documents, also the Iraq War Logs, also the U.S. diplomatic cables, sometimes referred to publicly as Cablegate, and also the Guantanamo files, which are, we know what they are, the Guantanamo files. So as I said, I reviewed, obviously, the collateral murder video in its entirety. I reviewed, for all of the documents I've listed, a significant degree of scholarly material recapping the relevant facts, as well as well-known high-profile journalistic accounts recounting the facts of those documents as well. And so, as I think everybody here knows, the contents of these documents have been widely reported on in such places as the New York Times, the Guardian, and other outlets which spend an enormous amount of resources examining the contents of the documents. I myself also have, in my own scholarship, in fact, used elements of the cables divulged in Cablegate, and so are aware of them in that capacity, in addition to my capacity as an expert today. And the Guantanamo files, of course, I reviewed selectively some examples of those files, in addition, obviously, as I said, to becoming apprised of their contents in the other journalistic, scholarly, and secondary accounts. So I will just say I'm not sure if there's anybody on the planet who's reviewed every single document. There are hundreds of thousands, but I've done my very best as a scholar and as an expert today to acquaint myself with their contents.
Thank you. Which my next question was, if you had an idea of how many files there were. You mentioned hundreds of thousands?
My sense is in total that's true. I also refer specifically in the report to specific number ranges for each document. So, for example, the Guantanamo files happen to contain 759 detainee assessment briefs. The cables, significantly greater number of documents. So they're not, each heading doesn't have the same number of documents, but together, I believe, yes, they're in the hundreds of thousands.
Okay. So if I can refer, there is, you mentioned the 700 detainee assessments. I have, the other parties too, I don't know if you have access to it. There is a Court of Appeal document, and I'm on page 6. Paragraph 1. I don't know, Professor, if you have this document, so I'll just read what I'm referring to so that it's clear.
I don't. Thank you. That would be helpful.
Oh, okay. So if everyone, I'm on the Court of Appeal document, page 6, paragraphs 1 through 5. I'm just going to list off what some of the documents that the Court of Appeal mentions were leaked to WikiLeaks. And I just want to, if we could just, there's only a few, and I just was hoping that you could just comment on the extent to which you reviewed the documents that I'm going to mention. The first one in the paragraph 1 on page 6 is appellant then downloaded 700 detainee assessments from SIP-per-net. You mentioned a few moments ago about the detainee assessments. So of the 700, is there a number? I know you mentioned that you consult them. Is there a number that you can give us, if you recall, of approximately how many of the 700 you might have consulted or did consult? Sorry.
Sure. I don't recall the exact number that I consulted. I believed in the course of the research, in the range of 10 to 15. And again, as well, I reviewed extensive secondary literature detailing the contents of those reports.
Okay, great. Further down the page, in the third paragraph, I'm still looking at the Court of Appeal document.
Mr. Lashley, I apologize for interrupting you. I just think for the purpose of the record, it's best to refer to it as its exhibit number. So we'll say exhibit 7, just so it's clear on the record exactly which document is being referred to. Thank you.
If I may also, Professor Matthews, I've emailed you a link to the Court of Appeal decision so that you can look at it if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. I've just opened the PDF, so I do have that in front of me now.
Okay. So I'm referring to C7, which is the Court of Appeal opinion or decision. I'm on page 6, and I'm in the third paragraph of page 6. And about halfway into the paragraph of the third paragraph, I am the line reads, the forensic evidence indicated appellant downloaded approximately 250,000 cables from the portal. The larger file was corrupted, and appellant was not able to upload all the information to WikiLeaks. Ultimately, appellant pleaded guilty to transmitting more than 75 classified cables to WikiLeaks. The cables included information concerning foreign government information that was protected for national security purposes. So I'm going to refer to the 75 classified cables which were uploaded to WikiLeaks or downloaded to WikiLeaks. Were you able to, in your assessment, consider those 75 classified cables that were known to have been transmitted to WikiLeaks? Were you able to consider those?
So my understanding that there are several different levels of classification or confidentiality headings that were accorded to the documents. So I wouldn't be able to say without going back and checking with any certainty right now. No.
Okay. Thank you. So now, and there's only a few more. Thank you for bearing with me. In the next paragraph, which is the fourth paragraph, beginning with also in March 20th, it states that the appellant downloaded and copied a classified report from the U.S. Central Command database regarding an administrative investigation into an airstrike. The report contained information relating to troop movement, close air support procedures, and other sensitive tactics, techniques, and procedures. It's not, unfortunately, it's not more specific than March 2010 and a report from the U.S. Central Command database. My question to you is, were you able to consult this disclosure or this document in your assessment?
There's not, you're quite right. It's quite vague, actually, what this is referring to. There's not even a document number attached, so it would be impossible for me to comment on that.
Okay, thank you. And the last one, the last document, which I'd like to ask, again, I'm still in document C7. but I'm on page 5, just prior. In the middle of the page, and I'll read the sentence just to give the context of my question. So this would be the first large paragraph on the page, and in the middle of the paragraph, the sentence begins with, through appellant's online WikiLeaks chats, appellant learned of WikiLeaks' interest in diplomatic controversy involving the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Iceland. In January 2010, appellant searched for a document related to the controversy and found a sensitive DOS cable entitled 10 Reykjavik 13 concerning the dispute, and subsequently this document was, as it mentions, was uploaded or downloaded to WikiLeaks. My question, again, is to know whether or not you were able to consult this DOS cable in your assessment of the impact of Mrs. Manning's disclosure to WikiLeaks.
Yeah, so I did consult this cable in the course of my work. It was also included in the mandate letter as something that I should review. I concluded in the course of my review that it was not part of the more significant revelations and didn't merit attention in the report itself, but I did consult it as well, again, as specific secondary source material relating to its contents and importance.
Okay, thank you. So my next question, you mentioned that you didn't consider it to be significant in the context, of course. So my question, by what metric did you assess what was significant, or I don't want to use the important, significant in your search regarding the documents? Because in your introduction, you mentioned, again, the most impactful aspects of the information. So I'm just wondering what was the metric you used to determine what was significant and what was not?
Sure.
Thank you.
I don't think that I just said that it was not significant. I think I said that.
Apologize.
No worries at all. My and I don't have a running transcript next to me either, so as much as I wish I did. But it's not that it's not significant, but in the course of what I was asked to do, so I'm now, just give me 1 second, looking, for example, at the text of the mandate letter itself, which asked me to talk about, to address the content of these documents, quote, from the perspective of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international human rights law, and law of war scholarship. And so the material contained in, for example, the Reykjavik 13 cable, while it's fascinating, particularly, for scholars of diplomatic history, of which I'm not one, and certainly anybody interested in broader questions of American diplomacy, I think it is a significant, or would likely be judged by those people to be a significant cable. But from the perspective, again, concretely of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, human rights law, and the law of war, it was not. It did not rise to the level of what I thought was the most significant. And so the metric with respect to significance, I would say, included a few things. One, the degree to which the materials were received in the public discursive sphere as being impactful and as being heavily consulted. So that's just basically an empirical question about how many people actually engaged with the material in a way that affected their thinking and their everyday lives. And so what we do know, for example, without question, is that the what's known as the collateral murder video. I'm sorry, I have 2 one-year-olds downstairs in case anybody can hear them. My partner's doing their best to keep them quiet, but I can hear them. But anyway, as I was saying, it's incontrovertible that the collateral murder videos has been watched by, I'd have to double check the exact numbers, and of course it's been posted on myriad different sites, so it would be impossible to tell how many. I believe, in the millions, well over 1 million folks have actually watched that video. So that's one basic empiric metric. Another, again, in the course of my assessment, part of what I was looking for was evidence or what might be reasonably construed as evidence of violations of international law, specifically violations of the specific areas of international law I've listed, and even more specifically, violations that might be thought to give rise to individual criminal liability under international criminal law.
Thank you for that complete answer. And I'm almost done with my questions. So I understand, and I understand it in the introductory phrase of your expert report, that your assessment is done from the perspective of international law, legal scholarship, public disclosure more generally, and you mentioned also law of war, I believe. Does your report or in your analysis, do you consider the impact of the disclosure of Ms. Manning's disclosure, the WikiLeaks disclosure? Do you consider that at all from a perspective of say national security or diplomatic relations?
No, my report does not address those aspects in any detail.
I asked this because when I mentioned the document, for example, the airstrike or the cables, there's mention of the content of the document relating to, use the exact words, I don't want to, documents that were protected for national security purposes. So my question again, I think you've answered it, is that that's not a perspective that you considered in your analysis?
No, I'm not a national security analyst, so no, I don't take that perspective.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions. Okay. In your opinion, having produced this report, etc., do you feel, what is your view, what is your opinion? Do you feel that Mrs. Manning's decision to share the documents with WikiLeaks, do you consider do you consider it legal or illegal? Do you consider it illegal? Was that clear as a question?
What law would I be applying? I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, I'm sorry. I understand the question wasn't very clear. Now, given your report and all that you've explained about the impact that the disclosure of this document had in terms of, from a perspective of, from the perspective of international law and public disclosure, do you have an opinion on whether or not you condone the decision to release these documents to the public?
So that's a really different question from the first way that you framed it, which was to ask me for a legal analysis of the legality or compliance.
I retract the legal question.
Oh, I see. Okay, so now you're asking
the first question. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's great. Right. So, are you asking me from the standpoint of my own personal moral assessment, or in accordance with some more general or more applicable moral framework that I might want to be looking to? There are many that I could draw from, of course.
Okay. Let's begin from a personal.
What I personally think of the disclosures?
Professor Matthews can answer this, but I would just object on relevance. She's here with a specific expertise, not as a fact witness.
Well, I'll retract that, and I'll ask you from the perspective of an expert in this field. Is that fair?
In an expert in the field of public morality. I'm not a philosophy professor.
Fair enough. As a person who produced the report, you've provided us opinion on the potential impact that it may have had in terms of public disclosure and international law in that perspective. Now, I'm presuming we're aware that these disclosures led to criminal charges against Mrs. Manning. Do you have an opinion on her decision to release these documents to the public?
Okay, I'm going to interject here. I apologize. You can try to answer that if you want, Professor Matthews, but I'll be honest, I'm not sure I even understand the nature of the question and what exactly the minister is trying to gather. So can I just, if you don't mind, let me just interject. My understanding, and this I'm referring to counsels for Ms. Manning now. My understanding is that Professor Matthews has been called in relation to the defense of necessity, which is being brought forward. Am I correct in that, Mr. Bloom?
Yes, you're correct.
Okay.
In the defense of necessity, and then our charter arguments are that you fundamentally need a balance between public interest and harm, and the illegality under international humanitarian law goes to that. But she's not giving an opinion on public interest. She's giving an opinion just on legality under international humanitarian law, nothing more.
Okay, so Mr. Lashley, maybe you'd like to just take a moment and raise your question in those contexts. Perhaps that would be more helpful than Professor Matthews' own personal viewpoint, or unless that is what you're trying to ask about what her own personal viewpoint as a Canadian citizen is on the subject. I don't know. I'm not sure what your question is trying to ask.
I apologize for it not being clear enough. In fact, I'm going to retract the question, and I'm going to end the questions. I think I'd have to think out more what my question was. I don't want to start going off on a bunch of things that aren't relevant or aren't to today's proceedings. So respectfully, I'm going to retract that last question regarding her opinion on that, and if you'll allow me to, with that, I'll conclude my questions for today for Professor Matthews. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Okay, that's fine. That's fine, Mr. Lashley. Thank you. If you want to take a few moments and formulate your question differently, that's fine too. We can give you that time. But if you prefer to leave it there, then that's fine as well. I'm just going to go. I think I might have a question for Professor Matthews, but I'm just going to go back to counsels Bloom and Gill, see if they want to come back to any points with this witness.
Subject to anything my colleague has in mind, I don't have anything further.
Counsel Gill, nothing else? All right, so just give me just a brief moment. I'll just double check if I have anything else I'd like to go back to. So, Professor Matthews, would you spoke about, we just heard you speak, and even yesterday heard you speak about different elements regarding the disclosures that were made, but it seems to me that, and I just want to know if you're of the same opinion based on your analysis, that the disclosure that would have had the most impact would be the video, which was parts of which were shown to us yesterday. And what I'm talking about in terms of changing what you referred to yesterday, changing the public discourse on warfare, war, typical methods versus counterinsurgency, etc. Am I correct to state it that way?
I think it, largely speaking, broadly speaking, yes. I think it would be right to say that the collateral murder video really initiated the conversation publicly, very much propelled Wikileaks and that whole project forward and into the public consciousness. But I wouldn't want to, in saying that, I think there are a few different, again, referring to this question of metrics and impact. We're talking both about public consciousness and what, let's say, lay people or the sort of ordinary person on the street without any legal expertise or interest in those areas may consider impactful. So in saying that, in other words, I wouldn't want to somehow lessen the impact, again, of the contents of the other documents, particularly, just saying it very simply and briefly, the extent to which they reveal the full civilian cost of the so-called war on terror itself. But I certainly think it's fair to say that the collateral murder video, in part just because it's so accessible, right? It's easy to find, it's easy to click on, it's something that's consumable in that format quite easily, had an incredible impact and certainly paved the way or created a sense of urgency that then propelled attention toward the contents of the other documents as well. But broadly speaking, I think that's right. If I could just, I'm so sorry, just to follow up very briefly, which is to say that the collateral murder video, and we talked about this at length yesterday, but just to put a fine point on it, of course, is about one particular incident, and the impact of the disclosures, simply can't be analyzed without attention to the far more detailed and copious, fine-grained details that were revealed in the course of them, right? So collateral murder is one specific incident that attracted a lot of attention and controversy and certainly critique, but is one incident.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't think I have any more questions, Professor Matthews. Thank you. I'll just make sure that councils don't want to come back to anything. Ministers' councils, did you want to come back on anything?
No, thank you. Not for mine.
Council for Ms. Manning, did you want to revisit anything with this witness before we let her go?
No, nothing further from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Matthews, thank you so much for your time and your availability to us. Your testimony is concluded, so you can disconnect if you wish, or you can stay on and observe, whichever you prefer.
Oh, am I actually permitted to stay and observe?
Yes, it's a public proceeding, so you can. I would just ask you to stay off camera and mute your microphone. It's
wonderful.
It's as you wish, as I said.
Wonderful.
Okay?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so as we discussed yesterday, there are no more witnesses being called in this proceeding. So what I'd like to do now is I'd just like to take an opportunity to ask the councils if there are any issues that they wish to go back on at this time, revisit, or anything that they omitted to mention yesterday, or even if there are any further questions, calling back Ms. Manning in her testimony if necessary. I'll start with the Minister's Councils. I say that because I have two things that I want to clarify. But I'll let the parties go first. So, Ministers' Councils, are there any issues that you'd like to go back on?
Yes, just give me a second, please. I would like to reiterate the objection of the minister concerning the report of expert witness. that were not qualified by the board, and also that the minister did not have the opportunity to cross-examine.
Okay. As we discussed yesterday, Maître Barrette, I would appreciate if you could make your submissions in regards to those reports in your final written submissions, because I won't be making a final decision on that until I render.
I will. Thank you.
So I would appreciate that, absolutely. And also, as I said, I did not qualify, formally qualify Professor Matthews, but obviously in my decision, I will have to do that one way or the other. So if you have any comments on that as well, you need to make them in your final submissions to me. Was there anything else?
No, that's it on my part. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Lashley, did you have anything else?
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, counsels for Ms. Manning, did you have any other points that you'd like to come back to?
Yeah, I'd actually just like to briefly raise a point, and we'll address it in our written submissions as well, but we thought it was important to draw the members' attention to this regarding Exhibit C9, filed by Minister's Counsel, which is the superseding indictment of Julian Assange, dated May 2019.
Just a second, sorry, C9?
C19.
C19, okay. Yes, go ahead, please.
You know, and we just want to raise this issue at the outset. Again, we'll address it in writing as well, but we just want to draw attention to the fact that this is an indictment, which is by definition a series of unproven allegations in relation to a third person, produced significantly, as in many years after the facts at issue. Many of the facts alleged in this document have never been proven, are still unproven. And we would just finally note that our client was called to participate in the grand jury associated with this indictment and refused to do so. And so we would strenuously object to any conclusion that there was any probative value whatsoever, any weight that ought to be given to the allegations made in this document. So that's we just wanted to flag that because it is a particularly troubling piece of evidence at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister's Counsel, did you want to respond to that immediately or do so in your written submissions?
I think we're going to do it in a written submission, Mrs. Board Member.
All right, thank you. Okay. I just have a couple of things I'd like to look at very briefly. One of them is really a point of form. Ms. Manning, if you don't mind unmuting your microphone, I'm just going to confirm a couple of things with you. Obviously, you are still under oath. One of them, as I said, is a mere formality since it's well documented, but I don't believe that, and unless I missed it completely, I don't believe that yesterday when you were being questioned by the Minister's Counsel that you did confirm on the record that you were convicted under the name of Bradley Manning. So can you just confirm that that was the case?
Yes, ma'am. My name change was it was in April of 2014, so that was prior to.
Thank you. The second thing that I'd like to just go back to with you, because I had an opportunity this morning, since we had a bit of a break, to review your testimony and to also review your statement as it's contained at Exhibit P9. So I'm referring to what is termed the Providence, is the statement in support of Providence inquiry. So it's much better to read it again after your testimony, because I actually understood it a lot better, all the terminology. After your testimony, it was a lot clearer to me. But I did want to just go back and clarify something that we discussed yesterday. So what you did, according to my understanding, in terms of how you copied the information, for the SIG Act, you had already copied the information to the CD or the DVD-ROM as part of your work functions, meaning that you were backing up information on a regular basis because of the nature of the computers and the fact that they may or may not always be in working order, and some of the information could have been lost. And what I wasn't clear on is two things. So the first thing is, was this a policy or an acceptable way of working for your colleagues as well? Or was this something that, it was not something that was prohibited, is what I'm trying to ask, that you would copy the information and place it in the, I guess you called it the conference room for other people to consult in the unit. Is that correct?
In this specific instance, I was specifically given that order by my senior NCO at the time, which was Master Sergeant Atkins, then Master Sergeant Atkins. So yes, that was a specific. It was specific. It wasn't I was given that order through the chain of command. And so yes, it was acceptable. Sorry, I didn't understand that.
You saying I was given that order? You mean given the order to back up the information?
Yes, ma'am. I consulted with a few other people, and we came up with we were coming up with solutions, and that was the solution that Master Sergeant Atkins came up with.
Okay, all right. Now, in regards to, that was what I read was specifically in regards to the SIG Acts. In regards to the other information that was eventually transmitted to Wikileaks, was my understanding, again, from reading this statement, was that you specifically copied it with the intention of bringing it back to your barracks and placing it on your personal computer. Am I correct?
For some of the, I think for the
I'll
the
go
diplomatic,
back.
I think for the diplomatic cables in particular, that is the case. Okay. I don't recall the other smaller things. The detainee assessment briefs, I think, is also something that I might have looked for. But I had previously been familiar with these documents.
Okay.
Excuse me, my throat's a little sore today.
We're almost done. Just a couple more minutes. Okay. Okay. I think that those were the two things I wanted to just clarify. So thank you, Ms. Manning. That's all I wanted to clarify with you. The last thing that I wanted to make mention of is really for the Minister's Council. So obviously now we're going to be going to written submissions. So we'll decide in a few moments on some timeframes for the councils to provide those submissions. I just want to make mention of something for all the councils, but particularly for the Minister's Council, since it's regarding their allegation. So the minister has invoked Article 342.11 of the Criminal Code. I do need to point out that obviously that section has several subparagraphs, and so I do expect that in the minister's submissions, they are clear in regards to which subparagraph or paragraphs are being invoked in their equivalency analysis, because as I said, it's not really specified in the report, and I just want the analysis to make it clear as to which subparagraphs are being invoked in terms of the equivalency with Section 1030 of the U.S. Code. So that was the last thing I wanted to mention on that. If there's nothing else the parties wish to raise, I think we can try to set a timeline for written submissions.
Actually, I'm sorry. I'm wondering, and it's possible our colleagues are not in a position to share this now, but it goes directly to your question. And we were wondering, just as a matter of fair notice, if they know right now which subparagraph of 342.1 they're referring to, that would be helpful for us to know in advance. It would also be helpful for us to understand with regard to subsection 16.2 whether the minister's theory of the case is that WikiLeaks is a terrorist group or foreign entity, or whether the disclosure of the documents resulting in disclosure to the general public is itself indirectly disclosure to a terrorist group or foreign entity based on a theory similar to what was rejected at Ms. Manning's hearing. And the reason we ask that is because depending on which theory they've adopted, it fundamentally changes the structure of our constitutional arguments. And so as a matter of sort of being able to better clarify the issues and keep things proportionate, it would be helpful if Minister's Council could offer us some clarity on that point today, ideally, or within the coming days, rather than having to wait for full written submissions to understand their position on that matter.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Gill. Do either of the Minister's Councils wish to respond to the question posed by Councillor Gill?
The only thing I can say at this time is all the minister theory will be in our full submission, and we're not in a position to answer a question today. And
Okay.
it's not something that we usually do anyway.
Okay. Mr. Lashley, is there anything you wanted to add to your colleague's comment?
No, I won't add anything to that. Thank you.
Okay, so in response to Councillor Gill, of course, you have a valid concern. However, that being said, the minister has indicated that they will expound on their case in more detail in their written submissions. So at this point in time, what I will do is obviously we're going to set a time frame. If for whatever reason councils from Ms. Manning require extra time than what has been allotted to respond to the minister, an application to that effect can be made and will be accommodated within reason. If you find that some of the allegations or some of the arguments were not exactly what you had expected or anticipated and wish to have more time to respond. Okay?
Thank you.
So let's start with the Minister's Councils to indicate the time frame for their written submissions. Can you indicate to me when you'd be in a position to have something ready for the parties, for the tribunal and for councils?
Sorry, I'm just opening my calendar. So today being the 8th of October. Beg your pardon? Sorry, can you hear me?
Until the Monday.
Oh, okay. The minister respectfully should suggest, November 8th.
Okay, so the minister is asking for a 30-day time frame.
Correct.
Councils from Ms. Manning, do you have any issue with that? That's pretty much a regular time frame for written submissions for the minister, so I don't find it unusual personally. Do you have any issue?
No issue.
Okay. So 30-day time frame for the minister, so Monday, November 8th. Of course, my comment applies to the minister as well. If for whatever reason the minister is not in a position to provide written submissions by November 8th as scheduled, they too can make an application to extend that deadline and give the reasons for that. Okay? So November 8th for the minister, councils from Ms. Manning, I can afford you the 30 days as well. And as I said, if your extra time is needed, you can make an application to that effect. Does that work for you? So December, we'll say December 8th, which is a Wednesday, but. And then, of course, the minister does have a right to reply, but I give a much shorter time frame for that, so it won't be more than about 2 weeks since we're getting into the holidays at that point. So how about for the Monday the 20th? Would that work for the minister? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Monday the 20th for the reply.
Very well. Okay. So I'll just reiterate, written submissions from the minister expected on the 8th of November by end of day. Written submissions for councils from Ms. Manning expected on December 8th by end of day. and reply from the minister expected on December 20th, end of day. So, Ms. Manning, as I had mentioned in my previous decision, I will likely be rendering a decision in writing, and so that will be communicated to you and to your councils once it's ready. Obviously, it won't be coming within this year, so it'll be at the beginning of next year. But as I said, I will make my best attempt to render a decision as quickly as possible, but obviously there's a lot of information to consider. Also, given the complexity of the material and the arguments that are being raised, I just want to indicate to council, don't be surprised if the panel does come back with a request for further clarification on certain submissions if necessary. Okay, so I think that that pretty much concludes the proceedings for now. Do the parties have anything else that they wish to state? What I normally do, Ms. Manning, is I do give the person concerned an opportunity if they wish to say anything that their counsels haven't already stated in the proceedings. I'm assuming you're letting your counsel speak for you, but if there's anything that you wish to add at this time, you can feel free to do so.
No, ma'am, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So if there's nothing else, that will conclude the proceedings. I would like to thank everyone for your professionalism and for obviously your patience in the past couple of days. It's been a lengthy proceeding, but I believe that we'll just wait for the written submissions, and I look forward to reading them. Thank you so much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.